English translation, 910th contact. Wednesday, 30th April 2025, 10:06 hours.
Here you are again at last, but welcome and greetings, dear friend. The time was long for me because I wanted to know what had happened regarding your search on Sunday the 13th of April 2025, when at 13:45 hours.
Greetings also. Eduard, my friend. But regarding your question, I am afraid I can only tell you that it is incomprehensible to me how was suddenly untraceable and simply disappeared after I was able to elicit. It is really very strange.
It is also not so important that I could not live with it. I probably realized and thought that anyway, that is why I went back to the coach house and brought Bernadette the corrected contact report pages. It was only then that Bernadette and I realized that because we saw that the pages of the report.
Exactly that should be prevented, and the preventing shall continue to be so, and for the next few years consequently, you shall not receive any visitors, no matter who it is, and you shall also not take any trips.
That is a good thing for you to say because
I know that, but
unfortunately you cannot because
then
that is so, and we also do not need to talk more about that. But what interests me is what you say about it. What I was asked, namely how you Plejarin relate to the fact that MUFON in America is conducting so-called research into UFOs, although this does not relate to your beam ships, but mainly to citing reports, conversations with witnesses, as well as film and photographic material and ground samples, which in any case relate to the foreigners. Already with your grandfather, as also with Simyase and Pa together, we realized that
I have been informed of this. And it is to be said that in this regard, as you yourself know, we have no interest whatsoever in dealing with these people of this MUFON, as well as with their so-called research. So they are not concerned with us, about which they know nothing anyway and deny our existence. Because the truth should be buried, but with the foreigners and their flying apparatus, which are generally called UFOs. They should continue to concern themselves with the flying apparatus of the foreigners and with all that there really or supposedly is to concern themselves with, but in which we have no interest whatsoever. We Plejarin, and you know this very well from my grandfather, stay absolutely away from the foreigners.
Of course I know that, and all groups of foreigners are also unable to locate you. Besides, I already know from Svath that their technology is far inferior to yours, and they do not even know that our creation consists of a 7-part universe existence, so their time travel, if at all, only relates to the countless dimensions of this Dern universe, but not to those of your Ankar universe, nor also to any of the 5 remaining universes of this or our creation.
That is correct. But I want to suggest to you that you should not say too much and not get involved in possible questions, if so this is not only because...
Of course not. That is not what I also have in mind. But look here. This is what I wrote regarding the fact that I now think that after around 50 years, it is time to slowly stop using the old word lamellus and start using the correct terms. So not just another version of the terms, but the right words and word explanations for old wrong words and terms that are either religious and therefore wrong, or simply not correct from time immemorial. Consequently, the new values set out what should be understood correctly as a whole.
That is good. What have you written regarding this?
Just this, if you want to read it.
Yes, of course.
Explanation: why the traditional terms only become open after many decades after learning and understanding the ancient teachings are openly named and taught in their effectively true value: teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of the life.
According to the teaching of the sage, my teacher Svath, and according to the instructive journeys with him into the past, I was taught that various traditional terms and their value, such as in the main spirit, spirit form, and spirit teaching, spiritual life, God, gods, and holy, saints, etc., correspond to old word values, which are called Indo-European roots and have been completely falsified. With regard to spirit, this was invented and created from the Indo-European term guise as the original word, although this originally had the meaning to be upset, to shudder as well as to be frightened and to be excited, but also to be afraid and to be completely horrified as well as to be seized, etc. When the word spiritus is considered in Latin, it does not mean spirit, but translated into German it does not mean spirit, but vapor, breath, or also breath sound, hiss, sound, breath of air, sigh, wind, act of life, or breath. So wherever research is carried out, nowhere does the word God emerge from these terms, as is falsely claimed, but rather something that is of a different value and corresponds to pure human impulses. This is also the case with the Latin word spiritus, which means nothing other than breath, or the ancient Greek pneuma, etc. So, for example, the word value of spiritus mundi from Latin does not have the value of world spirit, as is wrongly explained, but rather the value of world wind, world breath, or world breath, etc. The term holy is originally a corruption of the Old High German word heilag. Holy goes back to the Old Norse term uppheilige, a meaning clear, pleasurable, cheerful, bright, sunny, radiant, as well as later to the Old High German heilag, which had the meaning property or simply own, although this word was also used for happiness and healthy, as well as completely unharmed, and also as intactness and salvation, or saved. It was also used as a good omen and as magic, magic healing, and magical. Religious believers, usually fanatics who believed themselves to be scholars, took old words and terms from various languages and falsified them for religious misunderstandings and false explanations, just as the teaching of Nocedemion, which Germanul brought, was falsified in a bottomless and boundless lie, which triggered the delusion of Christianity and Islam and is still rampant around the earth today. If we now consider the false word concepts that were coined and falsified centuries ago from old word concepts by completely irresponsible religionists, etc., these were spread worldwide and misteached in all peoples and languages, and indoctrinated into the heads of earth humans in such a way that the whole of the evil false teaching hammered into them cannot be undone again with a bang. Not even by simply eradicating everything that is false through a completely different teaching, namely the teaching of the truth. The fact is that human beings first have to learn before they can recognize something as an effective reality and its truth, and then also comprehend and understand it. And this process already begins in the womb, despite the fact that the earthly holy sciences of prenatal and perinatal medicine and psychology deny this, and still have no knowledge of it. The fact is, as Svath was able to explain to me very impressively in the 1940s, and also prove in a natural development in a pregnant woman, that after approx. 10 to 14 days after fertilization by the sperm, the egg implants in the uterine lining of the woman. Then, as is normal according to creation, on the 21st day after conception, the embryo comes to life as a result of the creation life energy form moving into the embryo, and thus also enlivening the body of the new personality. The embryo begins to absorb swinging waves and impulses from the mother from the moment the energy is fully absorbed, which results in the promotion of embryonic physiological activity through an absolutely natural stimulus. This means that the absolutely normal process of the functioning of the development of the body and its organs begins, as well as the development of the cognitive abilities of the still absolutely unconscious perception, which strive for the developing and still completely unconscious comprehension of the connections, of which the human being only becomes aware after birth in the course of the first years of his life in the highly active consciousness and conscious thinking and learning, and also remembering begins. However, as explained, this initially only occurs in an unconscious wise, and gradually, only after about the 37th week of pregnancy after birth, in accordance with the slowly following perception of reality and learning as well as the conscious realization of what is effectively significantly registered. All of this is initially stimulated, developed and stored in the embryo through the influx of the life energy of creation, after which it is continuously absorbed into the developing fetus in order to continue its development. The transformation of the embryo into a fetus, however, only takes place between the 8th and 10th week of pregnancy, which of course also continues to develop unconsciously in terms of formation and absorbs further swinging waves and information in terms of stimuli, which only gradually become conscious and clear to the human being through learning and realization after birth. It is only through the evolutionary development of human beings that they develop good, true and realistic thinking, realization, grasping and understanding of perceptions. But these are initially still overlaid by everything that the embryo has absorbed in terms of stimuli, transferred to the fetus and brought with it through birth into effective life in existence. In the life of existence, the human being learns both language and also a great deal of what he hears and understands in terms of words and concepts, or is taught or mistaught, that is to say what meaning they have in a negative or positive sense, regardless of whether they correspond to correctness or not. He memorizes these words and concepts and lives with them, believing them to be correctness. If he does not think about them himself and does not independently fathom whether this or that concept or word actually corresponds or does not correspond to what it expresses. And the fact that human beings do not take this very own self-thinking into account and do not exercise it, but only believe what they hear and what they are beguiled by, is something they eat up in themselves. Therefore he holds on to concepts and words etc. that he has heard or learnt, but which are completely false, such as the concepts and words God, Holy and Spirit, etc., which have been falsely reinterpreted by erroneous and confused religious believers from old concepts and words into a false term and a fact-changing expression. In this way, from the point of view of religious belief, various vocabulary originating from ancient languages was absolutely falsely pressed into religiously invented terms and word designations that had completely different meanings at the time they were used, and in absolutely no wise had anything to do with an imagined and absolutely imaginary or invented God, Spirit or Saint, etc., and will also never have anything to do with anything. A God, religious or otherwise, has always been nothing more than an imaginary or fantasized concept that is made up and invented, imagined, invented, and assumed. The same applies to the Spirit of God. Spirit, such as spirituality and the absolutely impossible spirituality, but also to the terms holy, holiness, salvation, Trinity and other various religious phrases that are indoctrinated or hammered into human beings and thus beguilingly mold them into believers in religion. As a result, the believers become alienated from reality and blind to reality, which is also associated with blind fanaticism, which leads to violence being practiced against people of other faiths or those who are unimpressed by religion or who have no religious beliefs at all. Religious fanaticism even leads to self-mortification or penance in order to cleanse oneself of sins committed, and also to voluntary deprivation and suffering for the sake of a higher good. As a result, religious fanaticism also leads to self-mortification in the form of fanatical believers beating themselves bloody with chains, scourges and other harmful instruments, often to the point of unconsciousness, and sometimes even death. However, religious fanaticism also leads to believers fabricating or practicing self-mortification as a kind of asceticism, namely by somehow killing off or at least limiting their instincts. Just as the whole crazy fanaticism of faith also leads to the believing human being killing off sensuality, which means, for example, that this leads to a mortification of the flesh. This is done in sick fanaticism with the aim of faith that this will free the human being inwardly for higher things and therefore also for the divine. Now we have to explain the false doctrine that since the existence of the sevenfold universe, no imaginary God has ever created or created everything, but that without any doubt only that energy and power, which is simply called creation, could do so. And this creation is effectively no being and nothing other than all energy and power, which encompasses everything that exists in all its sevenfold realm of creation, or in the block of its 7 universes, which exist in 7 different dimensions within each other. Creation is therefore nature together with all its fauna and flora, the cosmos and all existence in general in the realm of all its 7 universes. The alleged God is therefore not creation, but only an invented and fantasized imaginary being without energy and power. So everything is a lie and deception regarding God and God's spirit, will and power, through which the world, human beings, Adam and Eve, the universe and everything in general was created, as can be read, for example, in the Luther Bible in the Book of Moses as the first sentence. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then the sun and stars, etc., as well as plants and animals. Finally, in Genesis, sentence 26, we read, "And God said, let us make human beings in our image." And so far, none of the believers in Christ have apparently noticed that the alleged God is talking about us or we here, and is therefore not the Lord and Master alone, but also his angels who are brought into play, who have somehow been involved. And if you look in the Jewish Pentateuch, Book 1 of Moses says, 1. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, after which it goes on to say in verse 26, "And God said, we will make human beings in our image, in our likeness that." Now what the Islamic Quran says about this is not exactly like this, but it is mentioned, for example, in the first Surah Al-Fatiha, Rukh 4 to Ekewaj, after he had created him, the human being. He gave him the understanding to recognize the essence of all things. And he taught human beings the properties of all things He implanted in human beings the ability to know the properties of things. Thus he provided. And it should also be said that, in contrast to the Bible and the Pentateuch, the Quran is much more valuable and better than any other religious work in terms of its value with regard to the words on peace and its pursuit and practice, etc. What is incomprehensible, however, is that degenerate believers in Islam of all people are spreading murder and terror throughout the world, because this corresponds exactly to the opposite of what Mohammed vehemently taught, namely that peace should prevail at all times and never violence. However, this was then attributed to an imaginary Allah by misguided and fanatical scribblers of lies and falsifiers of history, from which a religion very quickly developed that has been spreading murder and destruction in the world by fanatical and misguided believers ever since. This, by the way, is to clarify and help us understand that the actions and behavior of misguided and degenerate believers of any religion have nothing to do with the reality of religious teachings. Consequently, the asatans of all the Islamists who spread murder, hatred and destruction in the world have just as little to do with Islam as the murderous and profiteers of the witch hunts of Christianity also have nothing to do with Islam. But all this is really only in passing. So first, When teaching, the process of grasping and understanding the effective reality and its truth must be taught to human beings, so that they can mentally create the correct perception and understanding from it, so that the process of grasping and understanding could not and must not be prejudged. Only then, when everything can be recognized, comprehended, interpreted and evaluated as effectiveness according to correctness and truth, is the time come to name the new and all-round really clear and realistic as well as truthful values, in order to thereby dissolve the old traditional concepts and words of fraudulent falsehoods, misleadings, lies and misteachings, etc. through effective concepts and words, etc., and to reshape them through truthful word values. This is also the case when the ancient teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of the life, which goes back to Nocademion, is taught, so that from now on the truthful terms, creation energy and creation life energy, are taught and used, and all false unvalues such as God, Spirit, and Holy are not effectively replaced by the truthfully correct terms, designations, and word values, but are corrected. Spirit is to be corrected by creation energy and creation life energy. While God is not a person, figure, or a high being, nor is it omnipotence or the might of life, nor is it an energy and power with superhuman abilities. This is also the case with the divine spirit, which is based only on a religious and faith-based fantasy, lie and imagination, and therefore does not exist in any wise. The word holiness is also only based on faith, lies and fantasies, and like everything that is based on faith, has nothing to do with reality and its truth. And the term holy was remodeled from the Old Norse ilaga into the Old High German heilig, which basically meant property, good omen, good health, integrity and magic, etc. in its time. Just as in a school, teaching with detailed and precise explanations is rightly necessary, as is the comprehension and understanding of the school participants, their ability to grasp and process, but also the ability to reason, because these are indispensable and must be adapted. Consequently, a learning process is required that takes years and possibly even decades, just as the period of learning countless factors in the existence of life also lasts a lifetime, whereby new insights as well as a grasp and clear understanding of them arise from time to time through learning. Sooner or later, depending on the learning material, a better and clearer understanding of what is to be learnt is achieved and emerges, whereby the human being becomes capable of continuing to deal with higher factors and facts, whereby the old is overtaken and expanded, and perhaps the false and mislearned is weeded out by truth factors and now learnt in accordance with reality. But for this to happen, it is first necessary to learn and understand in detail what is truthful, after which, for example, the old and the false as well as the erroneously conventional must first be eliminated or corrected and expanded by something new. What is really to be repeated here is that it is effectively necessary to correct the old and eliminate the false. This, just as truthfulness and newness require correct learning, and the whole requires truthful comprehension and understanding, which is clear. It must be clear that every false knowledge can never be replaced by the truth, but can only be painstakingly learnt anew through appropriate true learning, study, and also through the necessary understanding of the truth. This is also the case with the entire creation energy teaching, which also includes the teaching of creation energy, life energy, and every other creation energy teaching. The prerequisites for understanding the new concepts and words are, of course, the learner's ability to comprehend and process, as well as the learner's ability to use sound reason and logic. These must be continuously grasped and comprehended, and thus applied in a good and correct way and with careful consideration. This is the only way to ensure that no new beliefs arise and that no contradictory misconceptions can also be attacked, which is the only way to guarantee effective success. Only in this way can the learning material become successful and useful in order to do justice to reality and its truth, and no longer simply consume faith. The human being who is addicted to a belief is only devoted to low intelligence, whereby stupidity means absolute non-thinking and has nothing to do with not being normal, as human beings generally misinterpret and misunderstand this. The human being afflicted by pathological low intelligence or non-thinking is fundamentally a very fearful coward, which he naturally denies in his stupidity because he is unable to recognize it himself. This prevents him from grasping and cultivating his very own thoughts, as a result of which he winds his way through life fearfully and cowardly and refuses to recognize his own cowardly fear of himself. This causes him, without realizing it himself, and without realizing why, to take revenge against himself and also against his environment and fellow human beings. In doing so, he is completely insensitive and does not know for what inexplicable reason he carries out all these actions, and fails to realize that he has not been granted any real friendship by his fellow human beings in his entire life, and that he is only exploited and disregarded. And even if a human being is honest with such a person and stands by him out of genuine friendship, even if he reproaches him for the incorrectness of his behavior, he is unable to consider, understand, and accept this either in terms of correctness or in terms of the help offered to him. The teaching of creation energy is extremely varied, and its extremely many effects to be explained are so varied that one lifetime of a human being is not sufficient to grasp and learn it, and consequently it is to be studied and learnt again and again by each new personality or through the consciousness of its vitalizing creation energy. This means that every new personality has to research and learn by means of its very own, free and absolutely neutral thought work, whereby it will only be helped by its own relevant and realistic considerations to find the correct solutions, and thereby achieve progress if it does not fall prey to any unrealistic determinations and is also not subject to such. It is therefore of constant necessity to check everything and every thought for its truthfulness. However, if the learning of creation energy teaching and creation energy teaching in and of itself is not approached in such a wise way that all these prerequisites are really taken into account, then the result for the learners or students is that they are hopelessly overtaxed, which would only cause damage instead of evolutionary progress and benefit. The traditional terms spirit, spirit form and spirit teaching are still too deeply anchored in the memory of human beings from time immemorial for them to be able to use the truth of the correct terms creation, as well as all the values of the creation life energy form and the creation energy teaching correctly. Moreover, the wrong understanding and the stubborn adherence to it is so mentally ingrained that it must first be learnt that much of the traditional beliefs are erroneous and false, and that the effective truth must therefore be sought, found, and recognized. However, this is also fundamentally the case with regard to the alleged rebirth, which is very much tainted by religiously traditional claims. In fact, everything is such that in many cases, even today as human beings gain access to more detailed knowledge, the effective connections and the true meaning of creation energy teaching are not really understood or are difficult to grasp. There is no doubt that this represents a new challenge for students. It is therefore extremely important for learners to be patient, especially to the extent that they do not simply consume the learning material or want more and more than is actually beneficial to them. Rather, it is important to constantly think very carefully about the knowledge presented and to test and apply it in practice. The human being must do his or her own research, knowing that not everything will be handed to him or her on a silver platter. Every learning human being, if he is attentive enough, who studies creation energy teaching with the recommended seriousness, will certainly realize that his understanding, his comprehension, his processing ability, and his logic will continue to develop if he makes the effort. This is noticeable, for example, when what was initially learnt is repeated and suddenly much more important and valuable information can be gleaned from its content than before. This also makes every single sentence of the teaching more important. With great wisdom, creation energy teaching is extremely carefully organized into a very clear structure that corresponds to the student's understanding and does not overtax those being taught, but instead introduces them step by step and level by level to the precious subject matter of creation energy teaching. This is done with the honorable knowledge of being helpful to oneself on the path to true humanity. Creation energy teaching is truly unique in its value, and when fully understood, is absolutely priceless and cannot be outweighed by any good in the world. This is deeply appreciated by many learners and students with great gratitude. SSSC, April 19, 2025, Billy.
I think that is well and correctly explained.
Then Bermunda asked if she could have the picture I was able to take when you and I were in America one night, and were able to photograph a beamship of foreigners behind the Capitol. Unfortunately, I do not remember when that was, so I am asking you if you remember.
That was about 18 months ago, so around June of the year 2023.
Aha, I will search the computer then. Wait, yes, here. It was on the 24th of June 2023, and it was the 850th contact. And here is also the picture, which I can then simply drag over if you dictate what we are talking about.
Capitol back of the building.
You can, then Bermunda can take it from the call report later.
Of course, good, so I will. But now something else. Since the bang, this is now the 26th time that, well, you know, a drone has been buzzing around our neighborhood. Daniela also heard the thing, which first buzzed around behind the fir trees to the right of the shed. Then later, when I went into the house, the drone flew away and buzzed behind the trees up on the mountainside, as Daniela said, where it then apparently disappeared. It came back twice more, once behind the house and once when I was in front of the house. There was no engine noise, just the whirring, to which Daniela said that nowadays there are drones where you can no longer hear the engine noise, just the whirring of the propellers.
I do not like that because it could mean danger for you. Remember why it was decided by the committee that for the time being.
Of course I know. I cannot just hide because I
understand that, but for once.
Yes, of course, but I will be careful, that is all I can do. But we have been through this before. I mean, there was a drone up here.
I do not know anything about that. When was that?
That was about 2 years ago. And besides, Bridget wrote an article that I still have here and can read to you. So listen.
Foreign drone over Hinterschmid-Rudy, Friday, 31st March 2023.
On the afternoon of Monday, the 20th of March 2023, I was in the center kitchen, busy cooking dinner for the Hinterschmid-Rudy crew. Suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, Billy dashed across the kitchen to leave through the rear exit. Less than a minute later, he came back in through the same door. It might have been around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At my questioning look, Billy motioned for me to follow him into the office, where he drew my attention to something on one of the surveillance monitors that explicitly showed the area between the house and Guido's trailer. He pointed me to an object that was incessantly circling above the construction site there, where Mark and Hartmut were present to give the path a bit more width. They neither saw nor heard the object, which was inaudible and invisible to the eyes of the workers. It must have been some kind of drone, which had the shape of a small but light-colored rectangular object that was about 30 centimeters long and about 15 centimeters wide. Bright yellow without a propeller and completely silent, so completely different from the drones, we know. That is why Billy had rushed to the scene of the crime to see what was happening. The strange thing was that although the object was clearly visible on the monitor, it was invisible and silent outside in the flesh. After watching the spectacle for a while, we brought Mark and Hartmut in front of the monitor so that they could also confirm the presence of the drone and what they had seen as it made its rounds. For my part, I hurriedly fetched my mobile phone from the kitchen to make a film of this process on the screen. Unfortunately, however, the object disappeared the moment I switched on my mobile phone. Consequently, we could only see the shimmering shadow of the drone for a while, then the spook was over. According to Billy, the drone was obviously not of earthly or Play-Aran origin, which Bermonda also confirmed later in a conversation with Billy. So once again, the object could only belong to a group of foreigners who were once again poking their noses into our affairs. Billy can observe such and similar incidents again and again on his surveillance monitors, which now make the center's surroundings visible everywhere for safety's sake, because he always has the monitors in front of him when he is sitting at his desk writing. Likewise, a large male personality dressed in a long grey cloak also recently materialized outside his office window. Despite an immediate check outside, the Visin suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth, only to reappear in another place immediately afterwards. Of course, this human being was also invisible outside this time, although Billy ran outside almost at the same time to see what this suddenly materialized figure outside the window wanted. Here at Hinterschmidruti, many such or similar strange occurrences are the order of the day. Often, one or more of us FIGU members witness them, even if, unfortunately, only rarely does anyone bother to pick up a pen to bear witness to what they unexpectedly saw. So there can be no question of Billy inventing such stories to make himself important or any such imbecility. Billy is a person of integrity. Anyone who knows him would blush with shame to accuse him of fibbing. It should also be said that UFOs have also been or are being seen in Schmidruti or in the surrounding area, but the observers generally keep quiet or remain silent, which is why we rarely hear from anyone. Bridget.
So that is it, and Bridget, Mark, and Hartmut can confirm the whole thing.
I know that strange things happen at the center all the time. But the new thing you are talking about is also really very strange. Be careful, because it can really mean danger for you.
It can, yes, but I am not going to be put off by it. But I have another question, which Svath has already answered for me, because a schoolmate asked me about it when we were learning about dragons at school, and the teacher used the term dragon. Your grandfather answered that by telling me that the term was actually a term coined in ancient times for fire ships that came from the sky, which in your sense simply means beam ship.
That may be, but I do not know about that.
Good, then do not. Then a question. Do you actually know all my books?
No.
But do you know the witness book?
No, what does it contain?
That was also new to me, or I had just forgotten about it. Bernadette made it, and it contains many testimonies from FIGU members, etc., who have experienced many things with me and around me.
And can I have that?
Sure, the witness book is also for sale, but logically, I'm giving it to you as a gift.
Thank you.
That is clear. But tell me, I have been wanting to ask you this for a long time. What do you think of Donald Trump, by which I mean his behavior and actions? Surely you have dealt with him, so you know what is going on with this man, who he is, and what he is.
What you say is correct. We have fathomed his nature, although the result is not pleasing, because basically he suffers from an illness-induced exaggerated desire for recognition and megalomania, as you once correctly assessed when you explained your findings regarding this man to Injana and Florina some time ago. So your judgment was correct, as we were able to conclude from our investigation.
Then I was correct in my assessment of him. He really does suffer from a huge pathological narcissistic personality disorder, which makes him dangerous and dictatorial, but which the lowly intelligent voters, in their ignorance of human nature, did not recognize when they elected him President of the USA. These people who voted for him are as lowly intelligent as bean straw, as is generally the case with the majority of voters around the world, because they have not learned any ability to judge human beings. So they are also not able to judge those who are to be put in power in any wise. This majority of voters behave as has been popularly said since time immemorial, like lowly intelligent cows that choose their own even more stupid oxen for mating and produce even more stupid offspring.
There is something about that. Because the Earth humans in question who dispute such elections overestimate their ability to make the correct decision of electing capable persons to state leaderships, etc., just as much as the personality impaired who consider their poor or even void leadership achievements to be special and unique.
There is probably no country on Earth, where I also include Switzerland, where the majority of those in power are not addicted to megalomania and an exaggerated craving for recognition.
The presence of overconfidence, self-aggrandizement, megalomania, and lack of leadership ability, etc., is absolutely unlawful in a state leader. But what is this? This page I read, Rashid, that was...
Yes, this is a letter from Isa. I have told you some things about him. He sent me the letter from Baghdad. Unfortunately, as I told you before, he was murdered. But you can read it. Also this one, which is from Jacobus.
Witness Book, page 38, 17th July, 1975. A Strange Beard Story by Guido Moosbrugger for Jacobus Birchinger, Switzerland, recorded on the 20th June, 1989.
As a rule, it is enough for a man to shave when he goes to the toilet in the morning so that he looks clean and well-groomed for the whole day. If he skips this shave for whatever reason, be it out of sheer convenience, lack of time, etc., then this is also not a bad thing in and of itself. However, this minor neglect cannot be concealed for long periods of time, as it is well known that beard hair continues to grow unstoppably, also during the sleep period at night, and so the bristly stubble on the face will sprout again the next morning at the latest. I am sure everyone is familiar with these banal observations, and they should also only serve as an introduction to the strange beard story that I was able to learn from Jacobus Birchinger. The story goes back to 1975, when the Eduard Meyer family still lived in Hinwell. Back then, Billy did not have a full beard like he does today, and people were used to him shaving regularly. Jacobus was all the more surprised when he was confronted with the following event. It was in the summer of 1975, on Thursday, 17 July. To be precise, when Billy left his home around 9 HRS in the morning, freshly shaved, and did not return home until the early hours of the following day. At this time, Jacobus was present in Meyer's parlor and was already waiting impatiently for Billy's return. He remembers all the details very well, as he assured me. After Billy had entered the living room, he had noticed two things in particular. Firstly, Billy made a very tired, jaded impression, which was particularly reflected in his eyes, which he seemed to be struggling to keep open. And secondly, Billy's beard was as luxuriant as if he had not shaved for a week. On the other hand, Jacobus knew for a fact that Billy had only been absent for a day and a night, which was nowhere near as long as the relatively long whiskers made him look. So Jacobus was quite right to think that things were not quite right here, because how else could the incompatibilities mentioned have been put together? Or what would you say if a good friend of yours turned up with a beard that was several days old, even though he had just shaved a day ago? You would probably first think of a magic potion or some unknown hair growth remedy to explain the phenomenon. However, neither of these assumptions are correct in this case, as the solution to the mystery must be found somewhere else. In reality, the following facts are involved. The Playaran friends had taken Billy on a great journey across our universe in Ta's large spaceship. And this extraordinary excursion, which had never before been granted to an Earth human, lasted a total of 5 Earth days. The fact that Billy returned home after just 22 hours, despite being away for 5 days, seems incredibly puzzling. But there is only one plausible explanation for this, and that is time manipulation. Another curiosity also came to light, however, because according to Billy himself, he did not sleep a wink day or night during the entire journey. The question involuntarily arises as to how it was possible for him to go so long without sleep. Billy explained that this was not his fault. Rather, he had been given certain foods that had always kept him awake. Apparently, these Playaran foods have an even stronger effect than the wake-up amines that are commercially available here. Who would be surprised, then, that after these 5 sleepless days and nights, Billy satisfied his need to catch up by going into a permanent deep sleep of 26 hours.
So, what do you say to that now?
What can I say? I simply take note of the whole of the 2 letters. I guess that is all I can do and also say about it.
Then do not. Also good. Then this article here, which I wrote recently. I was asked if I should read it to you and what you think about it.
Education.
With regard to upbringing, it must be absolutely clear that upbringing cannot ever take place through parents, etc., nor can the character and behavior of human beings be shaped by the upbringing of educators, etc. Education is also not somehow related to the previous lived personality, because the doctrine of reincarnation can and should never be taken into account in order to understand anything. It must therefore be completely clear that every thought, every form of character, behavior, attitude and action, etc., is neither inherited nor somehow predetermined, etc., because every new personality that is born arises according to its own thoughts, behavior and actions, and according to its own character to be formed. Every new personality, that is to say, every human being, forms itself accordingly, through its self-education, according to how and what it absorbs from its direct and indirect environment, and thus shapes and forms its thinking, decisions, actions, and behavior. This makes it clear that it is always and in every case the absolutely personal self-education that determines everything and every thought, decision, action, and behavior, as well as the attitude and, if no illness prevents it, the reason and intellect of the human being and what becomes character and behavior. Consequently, any education by parents or other guardians is pure fantasy, because it is absolutely impossible to educate a human being, as they educate themselves in every case and therefore shape their own character and behavior. This takes place in every single case and therefore with every human being equally, and in fact absolutely surely and inevitably in such a way that, at his own discretion and will, he appropriates for himself in terms of character and behavior what he hears, sees, or experiences. In this way, he shapes himself through his thoughts, attitudes, actions, and behavior, etc., according to the various influences that affect him. These influences, which come from other people, etc., and have and are intended to have an educational effect: normal, coercive, frightening or even violent, threatening or loving, etc., from parents or grandparents, as well as from other so-called guardians, from acquaintances, friends, or foreigners, have the same effect on every human being in each individual case. They do so in such a way that they accept or reject them based on their own judgment. That is to say, they fit into something that is ordered, simply presented or taught to them. Ultimately, however, it is the case that, through his own decision, he consolidates or rejects in himself, in terms of character and behavior, what is brought to him educationally, in an indoctrinating, hearsay, fear-inspiring, neutral, normal, loving, threatening, or violent way. Depending on whether or not he accepts what he is taught, or whether he adapts or rejects his character and behavior accordingly, he shapes his self-education at his own discretion, over which an educator never has any influence whatsoever. This therefore means that every human being carries out self-education in his life according to what he perceives from the outside through his hearing and all his senses of perception, whereby everything outside serves as a model for him if he aligns his senses accordingly, whereby one forms his character and behavior in a self-educational way. This is precisely the case when self-education is indoctrinated and sustainably shaped in terms of character and also behavior according to a role model. However, if this role model self-education does not materialize, but is effectively rejected, then human beings carry out a form and wise form of self-education that is chosen either positively or negatively, depending on how the human being consciously builds up his or her attitude and behavior. Every example of self-education, however it may take place, as well as self-education in the positive or negative sense, entails that the human being has a certain character and develops a format that determines his mind and his disposition. How it determines his entire character, his nature or disposition, and the nature of his personality, as well as his temperament and disposition, his nature or essence and nature, or his overall profile. The influences of other people, their ways of thinking, actions and behavior, etc., are factors that absolutely influence and shape, or not, the thinking, dispositions and forms of decision-making, actions, character formation, desires and behavior of the developing human being. And this happens according to what he accepts or rejects for himself. In other words, it is determined by whether he is positively or negatively influenced by what is brought to him from the outside, whether he evaluates this in a self-educational way and uses it to determine and shape his character, his behavior and his attitude, etc., either positively or negatively, as just or unjust, normal or degenerate, positive or negative. So it is never the upbringing of parents, grandparents or other guardians, etc., but always and in every case, if it is not a disease or pathological Ausartung, always the self-education of the human being himself, however he also degenerates or degenerates. All other scientific and psychological explanations are and remain only nonsensical assertions, as they could not be more ignorant and lowly intelligent, as Svarth explains. The human being, as such, should form himself into a true human being in every form and wise and develop effective integrity in his consciousness in order to be able to live and act in such a way that he can express himself personally with all the measures of his values through his behavior. Developing personal integrity against everything negative is to be understood as loyalty to oneself and to one's own righteousness, whereby the human being with integrity lives honestly in his consciousness and acts in such a way that he is always able to express his standards and values honestly in all his personal correct thoughts in all his life, behavior, conduct, and actions. This characterizes absolute personal integrity, which as loyalty to oneself proves that absolute integrity and incorruptibility apply to him. Furthermore, integrity also stands for the decency and honesty of human beings, as well as for their righteousness, trustworthiness, absolute reliability, and profound trust. And these are the values of true and effective humanity, whose high values also mean true love, peace, and freedom, which must be cherished and nurtured. The effective, true human being should be learnt from the ground up from early childhood onwards. However, truthfulness is often only learnt by human beings with great effort and necessity during their lives, if it is learnt at all, because it demands the hard existence of reality. Namely, that all negative things are rethought and a change towards the positive must take place, in particular towards honest and truthful humanity. This is because true humanity harbors extremely valuable qualities that are expressed when a person understands another person and empathizes with what is going on inside them and what moves them. In particular, these values are firstly mindfulness and empathy, which must always be characterized by respect and tolerance. Furthermore, honest respect, consideration and care must also be shown towards other human beings, because these are the absolute core values of what constitutes true human being, which, like true and profound love, true peace, and effective freedom, must be cherished and nurtured in all honesty and firmness of character. When the term true and genuine humanity is used, it is of course also associated with humanity, as it also has a broader and narrower meaning, namely that in the whole of true humanity and humanity shown to fellow human beings, everything that belongs to or is proper to human beings and relates to them is respected. In this respect, these are all high values that distinguish human beings from animals, creatures, and all other life forms, which also defines the true human being's attitude and disposition, as well as human faults and weaknesses. Unfortunately, this is also linked to the fact that human beings as such make mistakes, because it is said that to err is human, but this does not and must never mean that they behave and think inhumanly and also act wrongly in this way. All these values mentioned, as well as many other behavioral values, are the practical themes of the Nocademian teaching, which is the teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of the life, which should be learned by human beings on earth, and they should concern themselves with it, and thereby allow themselves to grow within themselves in order to become true human beings. In this respect, human beings should become true human beings and cultivate their true humanity, just as they should also appreciate and honor creation in the existence of all its energy and power of nature and its fauna and flora, everything that exists in creation and its endless existence. Sim Ya Se, Silver Star Center, 21st April 2025, reproduction of April 1949. Billy.
I really have not dealt with education so far, but what you have read to me makes sense and has value for me. But now I want to bring you another article from my grandfather's estate, for which I have to come here in the next few days to dictate it to you, as well as everything else you have brought up and spoken about, etc. The following, and to these explanations, which are not to be said openly, you can add the article.
What is to be understood further? Checked for correctness. Svath Saturday, 16th July to Monday, 25th July 1949. Edie Meyer, Niederflachs 1253, Bülach.
I have to repeat some of what I have already written in earlier articles, but in the meantime I have learnt many more important things that are also to be repeated again and again, so that I have to go back again and take up and discuss what has already been said elsewhere, but which must necessarily be explained in a different wise. What I have further learned from my wise teacher Svath from the Ankar parallel universe, and what I have also seen and experienced together with him, I will continue to record in writing in order to let those Earth humans know who are interested in the effective reality and truth, and who strive to become truthful humanity or want to be taught about it. These interpretations on my part should not only apply now and for the next 5 decades of this still existing second millennium, but also for a very long time in the future of the third millennium, which will not only be paved with wars and hundreds of thousands of deaths of human beings, but also with millions of deaths in the long term. This in addition to the fact that there will also be complete destruction and deadly ruin, as well as horrific misery and hardship in Mesopotamia in the east of the earth, and in various other countries of the world due to the state's greed for world domination in the far west. And what I am saying will all inevitably happen, mostly fueled by the world domination greed army of the far west, whereby this state has not only brought the First World War upon the earth in the last 175 years or so since its existence, but which is unfortunately only treated in world history as the 7 Years' War, which in truth was really a world war. And in the next 5 decades of this millennium, the responsible state leaders and their vassals of this state will continue to wreak further and very diverse havoc through various wars all over the world and spread very evil destruction. And this will also continue in the third millennium, without any state officials, leaders of states on earth, or the world's population doing anything peacefully wise to stop the murderous and destructive warfare of the state in the far west. Something that would be possible, for example, would be an economic blockade, especially with regard to the arms industry and luxury, etc., but the greedy warfare for world domination and world policing, as well as the scheming and insidious instigating of war by the Western state, will continue unhindered in the future, because all the peoples of the earth are obviously afraid of this state, and especially of its secret service and murderous machinations. Consequently, they do not dare to intervene out of fear, or they do not intervene because various states bow down out of false and feigned friendship, which is also possible and to some extent certainly the case, whereby most states bow down out of underlying fear and consequently allow everything warlike and evil to continue without raising any objections or taking any non-violent measures to prevent its greed for world domination. However, the states of the world would be perfectly capable of doing this, as I have already explained, by economically or completely isolating the distant Western state and preventing any supply of materials and goods of all kinds. All that would be needed, therefore, would be clear, reasonable, common and appropriate thinking and action by all peoples to stop, prevent and even put an end to the warlike, murderous and all destructive and murderous aspects of this state's greed for world domination. But this will not happen, because the majority of all state leaders, their vassals and the peoples is memoric, cowardly, and therefore cowardly. Consequently, as has been the case since time immemorial, nothing will be done, and there will be neither real peace nor true freedom. Thus, all Earth humans will continue to be maltreated with uprisings, rebellions, civil wars, murderous and destructive wars, etc. Now, in the future, it is obviously asking too much of the human beings of Earth, and especially of the state leaders and their vassals, as well as of the like-minded people of the respective peoples, who, out of sheer low intelligence, will fall in line with the misguided state leaders to effectively strive for and do the correct thing for peace and freedom. To do and strive for this is too much to ask of Earth humans, as Svath and I have seen and experienced in the near and distant future. The main reason why everything will get better in the future is that the good majority of Earth humans will become bean-straw stupid or non-thinking, uneducated and degenerate in terms of wisdom, because, as a result of religious faith and belief in the world, humanity will inexorably become more and more foreign to reality due to erroneous and confused beliefs, as opposed to a life-teaching attitude and the use of logic, understanding and reason. This will then result in an evil indifference and irresponsibility towards everything and everyone, so that in the course of time, Earth humans will become stoic towards all evil happenings. This is the case, for example, in the face of war crimes and uprisings, also rebellions, rampantly spreading diseases, as well as especially with regard to the madly growing overnumbers of humanity, as well as the steadily worsening crime rate, and organized crime and acts of violence will also increase from day to day, with violence in the private sphere also growing in the new millennium and the ever-increasing domestic violence breaking through. Arguments, fights and murders will become disasters, with the perpetrators being younger and younger human beings, children, adolescents, and those just entering adulthood. The poisoning of all land and the atmosphere, as well as of plant-based foods and water, will be equally disastrous. Murder of all kinds, manslaughter, rape and domestic violence, fornication, pedophilia, human trafficking, robbery, and other capital crimes of all kinds, such as arson, sexual offences, as well as depravity, etc., will also prevail. And in a few decades' time, a worldwide drug trade will break out that can no longer be controlled in the long term and will claim countless lives. And in a few decades, towards the end of this century, and then continuously in the third millennium, a completely new type of electronic crime will emerge, whereby fraud, child pornography and fornication, as well as deception, espionage, revenge, human trafficking, drug trafficking, slavery, and many other things will spread rapidly worldwide and become highly visible and uncontrollable. The human beings will become completely foreign to all these high values. This is just as effective peace and real freedom have been trampled underfoot by them since time immemorial, which will continue for a very long time until well into the third millennium, whereby these high values will be evil and wickedly mendacious throughout by inventing many freedom-building laws, ordinances, rules, orders and regulations, etc., and forcing them on human beings more and more in the future. As a result, however, the equality of all human beings will also be increasingly disregarded, particularly as a result of skin color and which religious or secular denomination a human being belongs to. In the times to come, the excessive and boundless tirades of lies by America's religiously biased leaders will bring much disaster and war into the world. Thus evil wars will be waged by America in many places, and especially in the far east of the world, just as a very far-reaching war will come about in about 4 decades in eastern Arabia as a result of vile deceitful lies. This will be instigated directly by America, namely by outrageous lies of the supreme leader of the state, whereby, however, in a second consequence, also by lies of his son, who will also become leader of the state shortly after the change to the third millennium, and therefore only 12 or 13 years later, the same will happen again. As usual, also through a completely irresponsible and monstrous work of lies by the leader's son, who will also rule absolutely and completely criminally as a lying leader of state, just as his father did before, because he will also have war waged in Arabia, in Iraq, in the same places, whereby the capital Baghdad in particular will be the place of all evil. This will result in many years of chaos, which will bring with it a great deal of crime and disorder. However, the world will not care much about the two murderous wars in Mesopotamia, which will cause many deaths, but will let it all go and even agree with the untenable, evil and criminal lies of the American leaders. Large parts of Iraq and the city of Baghdad will suffer greatly, and I would like to explain the following about them, which I have learned together with Sfath. The state of Iraq was created in 1920 from the three Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, Mosul and Basra, and from 1921, the country of Iraq became a kingdom under the Hashemite king Quetzal I. He was succeeded by Quetzal I after his death. He was succeeded by Quetzal II after his death, when he was only 4 years old, and therefore became the youngest ruler in the world, who, as Sfath and I have seen, will not live to a ripe old age. Now the city of Baghdad was founded in its heyday in the year 762 with the name Madinat as-Sawn, meaning City of Peace. The founder of the city was called Abbasid al-Mansur and was caliph. So Baghdad was founded as early as the 8th century and was the capital of the caliphate for a long time, where the successors of the herald Muhammad ruled for a long time, who after Jamanuel again brought the teaching of Naqadimion, which, however, was just as thoroughly falsified, and the religion Islam was made out of it. It was the same teaching of Jamanuel that was falsified and Christianity was fabricated from it. Baghdad is located on the Tigris River and was one of the largest and richest cities in the Muslim world and the known world at that time, and was also considered the cradle of civilization. However, Baghdad has nothing to do with ancient Babylon, as this was located elsewhere, some 90 kilometers further away. The land in Mesopotamia was called Mesopotamia, which still applies today because the two rivers Euphrates and Tigris flow through it. In this very wide area, which extends far north to Istanbul and up to the Great Sea, there were numerous small villages, settlements and places of worship in ancient times more than 23,000 years ago, but over time these sank into the earth and were covered by sand and earthquakes caused by wind, weather and earthquakes. However, this has also happened elsewhere in many countries around the world, with fields or forests growing over them. But furthermore, it was in these areas that the very first so-called advanced human civilizations were developed around 7,000 years ago. And what further needs to be said about Baghdad relates to the fact that in ancient times the city was always very important for the Arab Islamic world, and was the capital for the Abbasid caliphs, and also for the entire known Arab world for around 5 centuries, that is to say from about 762 to 1260. However, what is to be said about all the new wars to come, as has also been the case with all other wars since time immemorial, is that they will never bring peace, not even when they are ended. This is not because every war never brings peace or freedom after it has ended, but always, without exception, only occupying power, which harasses the defeated people through its laws and rules and guidelines, etc., and curtails their freedom in an unpeaceful manner. I hope that my words will clarify many important aspects that I have experienced and learned from Svath, or through many journeys with him into the past or future, and that I have seen and experienced together with him. In other words, when we have fathomed and experienced reality and truth in old and new times. The human being's evolutionary task, as I have learnt as a result of reality and truth and through experiencing life, is that he must first and foremost get to know himself in depth, and also that, as a materialized form of creation life energy, he must build up everything within himself into something good and positive in such a way that the wisdom and insight that he is not the all-encompassing and greatest thing, but only a small part of the whole, takes root in him. His senses, learning and aspirations should be geared towards and continuously realized, so that he protects and preserves all life, whereby the planet Earth, its atmosphere and climate, as well as the entire natural world and its fauna and flora, is the most important part of all life. However, to ensure that this remains the case in the future, human beings on Earth are obliged to take responsibility for themselves and to keep their numbers limited, which should never, ever exceed a total of around 500 million human beings. Otherwise, planet Earth and all its interplanetary treasures will be totally and utterly exploited and destroyed without conscience and irresponsibly and irreparably for all time. The entire precious treasures of nature with all its fauna and flora, as well as all its waters, will also suffer immeasurable damage that cannot be repaired if humanity overpopulates. But Earth humans will not listen to all the warnings, because their selfishness, greed for power, lack of conscience and indifference will make them do and act exactly the opposite of common sense in the time to come. The planet will be robbed and plundered of its resources by Earth humans in a tremendous and absolutely unscrupulous and irrational way. Just as much of nature itself will be destroyed to the point of complete irreparability and almost wiped out, so too will the entire fauna and flora, which will unfortunately also cause extinctions that cannot be replaced, as we have seen and experienced. A great many things will therefore be wiped out and destroyed, while many evil diseases, pandemics and rampantly spreading diseases, uprisings, wars, theft, crime and drug addictions will sweep through the whole world and take millions of human lives, while he will cause the climate to fall apart at the seams and overturn due to the irrational and unscrupulous and monstrously growing Earth humans, as a result of his absolutely irresponsible machinations. As a result, primeval storms will sweep over all areas of the Earth, while the heat zones will shift northwards and claim many lives. But the unreasonableness of Earth humans will nevertheless remain indifferent and self-important in their delusion of procreation and continue in the game of unreasonableness. self-aggrandizement, megalomania, and completely pathological irresponsibility. As a result, the sheer mass of human beings will continue to increase by the billions and thus drive up all evils until the inevitable and evil end. Earth humans are creation's beings who are endowed with an evolving consciousness and capable of logic, reason, and rationality. But, as a result of their increasing self-importance and their irresponsibility and indifference, they will become ever more bereft of these. For they will not care about them, and therefore also not about reality and its truth. This will result in him doing everything and anything in the coming time to bring about the end of all order, as well as all the misery of his reprehensibility, his negligence, his lack of conviction, and his depravity, which he will do in the following 75 years. Earth humans will drive everything up in indifference and irresponsibility, including the number of people to such an extent that they will overflow by the billions and slowly but surely destroy everything and also disregard the high values of life. The sheer low intelligence and therefore the non-thinking of lowly intelligent and irresponsible human beings, who live far from reality and do not think, will create an excess through the wild breeding of many billions of Earth humans, whereby the planet itself will suffer immeasurable damage and nature will also be largely destroyed, and its fauna and flora largely wiped out. Earth humans' consciousness, on the other hand, should be orientated towards evolution at all times, towards logic, understanding, and reason, which would, however, require responsible thought, but this cannot be achieved through a belief in religions and an imaginary God. Every belief triggers an unworthy illusory thinking, whereby every belief is in any case completely alien to reality and feigns falsehoods, which should be avoided, and only the high values of reality should be given throughout. And all these high values are to be categorized as development and practice, which they are: love, peace, freedom, honesty, justice, reality, truth. These values are all real energy and power of the life impulse, and this can be constantly improved and become stronger, just as it is also able to assert itself more intensively through the constant use of endeavor. Love, peace, freedom, justice, honesty, reality, and truth are always the highest values that ensure that human beings can always follow all creational guidelines and do what is right. However, this is only possible if human beings do not erroneously indulge in religious or worldly beliefs and are thus recommended and given the opportunity to think freely, independently, openly, clearly and rationally, and consequently, as individual human beings, to evolve and educate themselves responsibly through their independent and conscious learning, thereby recognizing and getting to know reality and effective truth, as well as also really understanding it comprehensively and living accordingly. However, this is only effectively possible if he necessarily turns away completely from all beliefs of any kind and is thus able to think consciously and logically, whereby he can make clear, logical decisions and move through his life with true, just, clear and valuable actions. What human beings have to learn as a whole and thereby become aware of what life and learning to live really mean and how they should live and lead their lives effectively. can only be based on consciously using creation energy and its power in their daily lives and allowing it to manifest within them, whereby they can allow all the necessary knowledge to grow within them. However, no religious or worldly beliefs are permissible for this, just as no assumptions and theories are also appropriate, suitable or necessary, because an assumption or theory regarding the effective truth and regarding learning are completely wrong, especially with regard to the conduct of life, because assumptions and theories always correspond only to an obstacle, because they are truthfully based only on assumptions, but never on effective facts of reality and its truth. The truth is that assumptions always correspond only to assertions, speculations, and conjectures, but never to effective reality and truth. Therefore, the true values of reality and truth can never be found in them, and consequently nothing can ever be confirmed by these unvalues. In particular, an assumption or theory regarding the way of life generally only leads to confusion and, as a result of this, further and further confusion, so that the increasingly confusing problems increase and result in a lack of understanding and swimming in a chaos of thoughts and in an unparalleled confusion in such a way that every logical solution is pushed away from the correct way of life. Consequently, no life situations can ever be practically translated into reality through theories, but it is effectively always only realistic and truthful thoughts and the positive realizations arising from all these, as well as the resulting actions, that lead to success. This is particularly the case when it comes to learning to make a real and true human being of oneself through one's own realizations, energy, and strength. This requires a great deal of understanding, tolerance, and true neutrality towards oneself, but also joy and perseverance, as well as honesty towards one's own personality. It is also very necessary that the important work to be done mentally, emotionally, and also behaviorally is done with enthusiasm, generosity, and an honest willingness to help oneself. However, this is also necessary with regard to correct and good cooperation with a human being known to you, as well as with unknown fellow human beings, because their empathy and forbearance are also essential. Just as loyalty as well as real and honest love, but also understanding for oneself are so important, as is the knowledge and awareness of creation itself, which as a whole is the existence of everything visible and tangible, as well as everything invisible and intangible, everything that exists, and therefore not the work of a religious, imaginary God, as deluded people erroneously and delusionally imagine this imaginary figure and worship it imploringly and beggingly. Well, God Creator, etc., does not effectively exist, neither in the Christian religion, nor in any other religion, because God is in any case always only an imaginary figure, and figure imagined according to faith as well as erroneously and confusedly, an absolutely erroneously and confusedly invented imaginary figure or personality that is elevated as God, who has perhaps acquired very special abilities, which are then described by fellow human beings in their short-sightedness, small-mindedness, and in their amazement and failure to understand the real and its truthfulness as miracles, miraculous powers, and as divine, supernatural, Elysian, that is to say, from the abode of the blessed in the future. This is the belief of human beings of religions, as well as their sects or other believers of any kind and faun. The human beings who, since time immemorial, have been deprived of their senses as a result of their faith, which is why they imagined far-away travelers from the vastness of space who were immeasurably superior to them in everything as God and gods, and placed them above everything they knew. But truthfully, only the true creation exists, which is everything and everyone, the whole of nature with all its fauna and flora all around, as well as everything that exists on all sides in the entire realm of the respective universe, and all dimensions in general, and in sevenfold form, as Sfath teaches. Creation is not a god, and this imaginary god also has nothing in the least wise to do with effective reality and truth, but with lies, deception, and fear-mongering, cowardice, fantasy, and money-making, as well as the exercise of power. And all this truth corresponds exactly to the teaching of Nocedemion, which is the teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of the life, which teaches that the human being alone, and indeed every genus and species of human beings in the entire sevenfold universe realm of creation, which was created from the absolute absolutum, which was created as the last absolutum form from the sign absolutum, which in turn emerged from an impulse of the nihilo that is in endlessness and eternity, and thus became and remains in eternity in endless duration. This means that neither an imagined god or gods nor any human being is above the human being, but that he alone is master of himself in every form. And creation, which is all existence and energy, as well as the power of everything that exists and exists in its entire immeasurable space, which is divided into 7 other dimensional universes or parallel universes, and thus contains them within itself, is neither demanding, commanding nor resentful, but absolutely neutral, so that human beings alone have to determine and can determine how they should lead themselves, how they should live and learn. Creation proves itself to be an effective pole of peace in everything and everyone in an absolutely free form. And so in fauna and flora, everything and everyone that belongs together can really live together in peace and freedom, without harassing each other in any wise. The human being as a species should also live in this way, even if the human beings belong to different races and are otherwise different. Either way, they are members of the human being species, however they are. And this is regardless of whether all human beings are uniform or different in their external appearance and internal organic structure. It is also completely irrelevant whether they are human beings according to general earthly understanding, or whether they are similar to humans or completely dissimilar to humans, such as reptile-like or bird-like, or somehow alien, etc., which cannot be defined at first glance. However, they are all beings that have emerged from the work of creation and are to be respected, appreciated, and honored in every form and according to their genus and species. Everything implies what has been explained and said so far, as well as what is still unsaid and unexplained, that human beings, human equals and human likenesses, etc., must maintain peace and freedom among themselves, as well as respect, esteem, honor, and dignity, and uphold all these values, without quarreling, lying, cheating, lust for power, greed, hatred and strife, fighting, murder and manslaughter, violence, capital punishment, war and terror, and also without criminality and crime, etc., and without endangering anything or everything. But this of all things is something that has unfortunately been disregarded by human beings on earth since time immemorial, and is therefore common practice in a negative sense. As the various subterranean artificial memory armies in China also amply demonstrate, as elsewhere on earth the inhabitants of the earth's interior, the ant people, also had their subterranean habitats. The earth humans, as the most distant descendants of those who travelled far away, are afflicted by all kinds of negative things, just as nuclear warfare was wreaked on earth very early on by those who travelled far away. This alone proves that the earth of the Sol system is not the only life-bearing planet in the entire cosmos, and that human beings on earth are thinking completely wrongly in this respect, because as I have seen and experienced with Svath while traveling through space and time and through space, there are countless planets and planet-like moons in the vastness of the many galaxies and solar systems in the huge cosmos. Many of these planets and huge moons also carry life, faunas and floras, and on many diverse worlds there also exist beings that also have conscious forms of consciousness and are human-like as well as human-unlike. Some of them are peaceful, while others are unpeaceful. Various are able to move through space and time as a result of their knowledge and highly developed technology, with some also being able to determine the destination of the earth consciously sought or found by chance, which were considered gods and goddesses, and sometimes also bird beings, etc., by the earth's inhabitants. In many places, this led to bird feathers and feathers of large bird-like creatures such as chickens, cranes, eagles, peacocks and swans, albatrosses, eagle owls, storks, narraboo, geese, condors and pelicans, etc., being worshipped by the earth humans and used as honor and adornment, especially by the early immigrant natives of the old western continent around 23,000 years ago, as Svath explained. This was also partly done by the Norsemen, who according to today's chronology were already in the western continent around 23,000 years ago. In particular, such feathers were worshipped by the Aborigines. The Hironi note 2025, according to Wikipedia, Clovis, human beings, who had migrated from the then northern continent to the western continent around 23,000 years ago, when the Bering Sea was not yet there and only emerged when the last millennia of the last northern continental cold epoch came to an end. At that time, the Bering Strait or Bering Sea did not yet exist, but there was a land connection between the northern continent and the western continent, that is to say, a land bridge between the two continents. This meant that the two continents were connected with each other, so that human beings were able to travel from the northern continent to the western continent. Seen today, it can therefore be understood that people migrated from Asia to North America. Well, what later emerged with the feathers as a hereditary factor was further transferred to the most distant descendants of the Hironi or Clovis human beings, the Indians, who were mistakenly called that because Christopher Columbus, who discovered the western continent, which had been colonized by the Northmen long before him, but who left again, thought he had come ashore in India, which is why he called the country Indias. Well, much will be found and excavated by archaeologists worldwide in the future, which will confirm much of what I have written down and have also been able to see, witness and experience extensively with Sfaf at various ages. And in the future, there will also be sufficient proof of the former existence of those who travelled far away, even if this has not yet been brought up at this time and is considered fantasy, and nothing has yet been found to testify to the truth of my words. Unfortunately, it will be the case that many things will be misinterpreted, partly out of dogmatism, craving for recognition and megalomania, etc., which will continue for a long time and well into the next millennium. Lies and deceit and many falsehoods, falsifications, swindlers and know-it-alls will appear, as will envious, hateful, fact-twisting, malicious, profit-seeking and prestige-seeking people. And what will happen in the future, especially in Europe, is that many old but worthy buildings will be torn down to build new ones for the extraction of energy from within the earth. However, many old buildings will be mistakenly regarded as resting places for the deceased, which will then be dated 10 times younger than they really are. And so many scientists and researchers of the future will interpret false assumptions as truths, just as they will also use them to falsify the truths and deceive Earth humans. While already at the present time the Earth's population is being bred in a really bad way, and will then get out of hand, and consequently many billions of human beings will be born, and thus the Earth will be overpopulated. The delusion will increasingly arise that more and more human beings will have to populate the Earth, resulting in an immense overpopulation of Earth humans, through which the planet will be completely and irresponsibly exploited in terms of all its resources and hunted to such an extent that many things will fall apart at the seams. In addition to the fact that nature as a whole and all its fauna and flora are also being badly damaged, and many things will be finally and completely wiped out thousands of times over, year after year, and for all time. This is in addition to the fact that all lands, meadows, fields and pastures, as well as forests and moors, are being poisoned with chemical fertilizers that are harmful to nature through alleged nature care and natural foods or vegetables, etc., for the sake of good growth by agriculture and nurseries, as well as by private gardeners. Poisons that also endanger the health of human beings and animals, creatures and all wildlife forms in general, cause various types of cancer in human beings, not only poison all the waters of the land and the seas, but also poisonously pollute them with all kinds of plastics and waste, so that many aquatic creatures eat this stuff, or just come into contact with it, is enough for them to die miserably. And all this is approved without hesitation by those responsible for the state, because they receive bribes for it, and will of course vehemently deny this and claim that a minimal amount of poison of this or that kind is neither harmful to human beings nor to fauna and flora. This is in spite of the fact that, on the contrary, even the youngest children are taught and told that even the smallest amount of poison can be fatal, which is why they should never eat anything poisonous. The sheer mass of Earth humans will mean that very bad machinations will largely destroy nature and its fauna and flora worldwide, even wipe out countless species, and thus also bring about a climate upheaval. This, as the Americans have already brought about through their absolutely irresponsible nuclear bomb tests, and the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is in addition to the fact that much has already been done over the last 100 years to prepare for the coming climate crash, which will have a severe impact in the new millennium. In many cases, the weather conditions will be too wet and will bring huge floods due to extreme rainfall and hailstorms, as well as causing landslides and mudflows, whereby the soil will also soften and lose its grit, and glaciers will also melt, and thus cause disaster, as when wild torrents of water wash everything away. On the other hand, severe drought will cause many food crops to wither or fail to grow due to a lack of water, causing human beings to increasingly resort to chemical food products, thus jeopardizing their health more and more, and leading to illnesses that often cause lifelong suffering, if not death. Unfortunately, human beings, in the excess of their gigantic masses, and as a result of all their destructive machinations against nature and its fauna and flora, especially with regard to the misuse of chemical toxins of all kinds, which are mainly applied to nature and its fauna and flora by agriculture and large-scale garden centers, allotment gardens, and sometimes also privately, will also bring a great deal of disaster to the world in the future. This will also happen through uprisings, rebellions, crime organizations, and many wars that will be waged irresponsibly around the world and cause countless deaths. Religious fanaticism will also be responsible for this, especially in the Christian form of fanatical Christian organizations, which will range from small groups of a few or a dozen to large groups with 1,000 or more members. And in about 5 years, a religious sect will be founded which will carry out secret murders and indirectly force its members to have no contact with non-cult members and only according to the sect's instructions. In addition, Islamist terror will emerge, but this will not be compatible with the religious Islamic doctrine of faith or with the Islamic behavior and Islamic art of Islamic states, because these Islamists will be criminally murderous and will make their appearance at the turn of the millennium. To this end, it is probably necessary to explain the following. The human beings of Islam, that is to say not the Islamist terrorists, will not be called Islamists, but either Muslim or Muslims, so in future it will be completely wrong to call members of Islam Muslims Islamists, who are supposed to follow 5 recommendations or 5 pillars in their lives according to their faith. Muslims have faith in their God Allah, to whom they should pray 5 times a day, wherever they are, but if possible on Fridays in the house of God, in the mosque. Islamist terror will become a threat to the security of the world, especially in the form of terrorist violence. Consequently, in around 3 to 4 decades at the latest, Islamism as a politically ideologized form of Islam will become a danger and will also be understood as such. However, this form of political extremism will only be practiced by an absolute minority of Muslim believers and will also have to be clearly excluded from the religion of Islam. The Islamists of the future will invoke the supposedly original and unadulterated Islam of the 7th century after Christ, whereby an allegedly necessary restoration of an Islamic order is to be guaranteed. According to their false fanatical understanding, this is to become the only correct and legitimate form of society and state, whereby it is the case as Sfaf and I have learnt from the Islamists of the future that in this fantasized original Islamic order, all areas of life are to be shaped in the way that Allah, through the Prophet Muhammad, is supposed to have modeled the Quran. Militant Islamists or jihadists, as they will also be called in the future, will feel called upon to enforce the fantasized old Islamic order through violence and terror, whereby they will refer to a supposed instruction for jihad or inner struggle contained in the Quran. This will be falsely interpreted as a holy war, which, contrary to the valid legal conception of Islam, will be fantasized and directed by the Islamists as a holy duty and permanent war against all other believers and enemies of Islam, and will mostly refer to the Jews and Christians or to the infidels in general. According to their ideas, the terrorist Islamists will strive for an Islamic state and try to enforce this through murder and destruction in the name of the violent terrorist jihad they have devised, which will be called Islamic State worldwide, whereby these Islamists will also associate themselves with a global terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. In the new millennium, the whole world will be the focus of Islamist terrorism, which means that there will be a constant threat of Islamist terror on earth. The Nazi mindset will also become rampant again, especially in the way that Nazi-minded people will interfere in wars with war materials and money, thus creating evil enmity and a strange world war, whereby Germany will be at the forefront when a war lasting several years takes place in Eastern Europe due to the governmental insidiousness of the Far West. Just as a war slaughter against the Arabs will also break out in the Middle East, organized by a Hitler like Hitler. Just as a few years ago, the Nazi regime and the World War almost carried out a genocide against the Jews, whose distant descendants will do the same in about 75 years' time. This is because a like-minded mass murderer and false Jew will do the same murderous things to believers of Christianity and Islam in the Orient out of revenge, greed for power, and as a hater of foreign religions, as Hitler did in the last World War. And once again, state leaders and the majority of the peoples of earth will look on and even approve of everything, because here too, partisanship and injustice will come before justice. And it will be so, because at that time the earth humans will steadily and rapidly degenerate and fall prey to indifference and irresponsibility, as well as to crime and criminality. Greed for wealth will spread, so that ordinary citizens will rake in millions and billions, while countless human beings will have to live on the streets because they will no longer be able to afford the expensive rent for their flats and will therefore lose everything. In addition, many human beings will be afflicted by diseases, especially cancer, which will be due to, but will be denied, the vast amounts of chemical toxins being released into the natural environment, especially by agriculture, horticulture, and industry. A great many toxins are also poisoning the atmosphere, and thus many human beings, and also the flora and fauna as a whole. especially through exhaust fumes from petrol and diesel-powered vehicles of all kinds. The excess of the Earth's population will also increase rapidly, which is to be mentioned again and again, because the huge mass of the Earth's population will be the greatest source of all coming and all destroying disaster. In the future, there will also be a very bad lack of education throughout humanity, and even a kind of general depravity in this respect in the majority of humanity, which, together with indifference and irresponsibility, will lead to many of the power-hungry leaders of all states on earth, especially the industrialized states of Europe, oppressing the citizens with the evil help of their vassals through new laws, ordinances, fines and rules, etc., and bogarting them through regulations and nonsensical orders, decrees, recommendations, directives and edicts. Many rights and also sensible behavior and actions of ordinary citizens will be prevented and punished if the righteous do what is correct and necessary and act sensibly, whereas in the near future the authorities and state leaders will begin to order nonsensical punishments. However, this will only be the beginning of Earth humans being forced completely under the thumb of the leaders of the populations, and the emerging artificial intelligence will also help them in their evil deeds, as will the forces of the financial world, which in their greed for wealth will also force the populations of the countries under their financial thumb. The personal freedom of Earth humans will be more and more restricted and burdened by many evil wars and unworthy things, especially because America, greedy for world domination, will create mischief and wars all over the world and, as it has done since time immemorial, will act as the world police and create discord in the world. And all of the above will become and be so when the teaching of Nocademion is conveyed through me, the teaching of the truth, the teaching of creation energy, the teaching of the life. Earth humans will not allow themselves to be taught the truth, peace and freedom, because the false doctrines of all the religions and sects have a powerful effect on human beings and strengthen them in their erroneous delusions of faith. This is because human beings have been caught up in these lies since time immemorial, indulge in them, and will not allow themselves to be taught. And it will still take decades, even until the beginning of the next millennium, before it will finally be openly recognized that diverse life exists in the universe, in everything and everyone, on planets and large moons, in the form of human-like, human-unlike, and other self-thinking life forms. This even in every area, in water, in every stone, as well as in ice and in every soil, in which viruses and worms cavort, as well as microscopically tiny creatures and bacteria, but also microbes with their genetic and functional potential exist, whereby these are released sooner or later and can then begin to live and work. This is also the case in the millions of years old ice of the Antarctic and the Arctic, where deep waters, mountains and valleys exist under the kilometer-thick ice mass of the Antarctic, as well as many kinds of life, such as microorganisms, and also very strange fish, octopuses, sea spiders, and many other life forms, as I was able to see together with Svath. There were often tiny single-celled organisms, which do not have a cell nucleus, but which nevertheless produce life, as Svath explained. and a great deal of life has also developed from such cells on Earth and adapted to earthly conditions, like all life in general, right up to the life form of the human being itself. And when it is said that life developed from the waters of the earth, seas, etc., it is to be understood that in the beginning, however, the origin of life was brought here from outer space, namely by comets and their ice, which, as long-term space travelers, spread the most life spores along with space dust. As a result, all formations in the entire solar space are also populated with a lot of life, even if this is not perceptible on the surface. Meteors and asteroids also often carry life, as do metals and minerals that also occur on Earth or are completely Earth foreigners. But this also applies to the space dust itself, because space is probably empty of air, but countless and diverse types of amino acids, microbes, viruses, oxygen, and even microalgae and plant her seeds and subatoms, etc., are buzzing around in it, and let them drift into the atmospheres of planets, as well as onto moons, just as they fall onto comets, meteors, asteroids, and other space travelers. This means that planets and also moons are inseminated when everything falls on them and spreads. This has been happening since the beginning and continues to happen, just as various moons in the solar system not only store water through their ice, but also harbor microlife, etc. within them. When life-bringers are driven around by the space dust, they float down onto planets and various moons, which, if they are capable of carrying life, are then able to allow the seeds from space to take root and develop and flourish, thus emerging from the energy and power of the planet or moon, and thus becoming planetary or lunar in every form, but originally brought from space or outer space. And this is also what happened on Earth in the Sol system and on its planets, etc., where everything came from the universe, flourished and became, continues to do so, and will unfold according to possibility, and thus become planetary. This may be by the germs falling from outer space onto the earth and germinating, or falling into the seas and waters and germinating and developing into faunal or floral life forms. Through the evolution of the blown seeds from outer space, or brought by comets, meteors or asteroids, millions of fauna and flora are formed, but now and then life forms traveling far away from the vast universe bring seeds and other extremely alien fauna and flora with them, which can germinate, grow, and really develop if the correct climatic and other conditions are effectively given and thriving is possible. Many seeds, etc., that are able to travel through space can remain fertile for centuries and even tens of thousands of years, and also survive in the soil or in the waters of a planet or moon and in their ice, only then to germinate and develop fauna or flora. However, this is always the case when the climate, weather, and gravity correspond to what is necessary for everything to develop properly, or for the seed to unfold and thrive. And this happens on many planets, as well as on moons capable of supporting life in all the vastness of the cosmos of creation, which has existed in its entire space in sevenfold universe numbers for countless billions of years since time immemorial. In the vastness of the cosmos, in each of the 7 universes of creation, there are galaxies and solar systems with planets and moons, with asteroids, comets and meteors, in many cases also with wandering planets and wandering meteors, which exist in solar systems or as small or large space wanderers. Space wanderer, such as comets, meteors and asteroids, but also human beings or human-like life forms that are somehow humanoids. That is to say human-like, but also different, and not in the sense of the appearance of Earth humans, as this corresponds to Earth humans as Homo sapiens sapiens. The lineage of the humans does not descend from an ape lineage, as Charles Darwin claimed with his theory, because the evolved Earth humans developed in a special way from the ground up in different life form phases with a DNA that was specially adapted to him, as it exists in the entire life form realm of all life forms in all matter belts in the sevenfold dimensions of creation itself. This means that, without exception, all life forms, including human genera and human species, as well as human-like beings in the entire matter belt area of all 7 universes of creation, are provided with DNA according to their genus or species. Thus, not all human genera and human species in the vastness of the material belts or the cosmos of the sevenfold universes of creation have a uniform DNA, but are as different as genera of life forms exist. Note Wikipedia, March 2025 explanation: deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short, is a macromolecule made up of 4 different deoxyribonucleotides in the form of a double helix. DNA contains the genes that encode the structure of all proteins, and therefore contains almost all the information necessary for cell function. This also applies to all those human beings and other beings who have traveled further afield, as well as to all the various human-like life forms that came to Earth, whose bodies were reptilian, bird-like or animal-like, and so on. And the Earth humans, some of whom were distant descendants of those who had traveled further afield, and had forgotten their earlier ancestors, generally regarded those who had recently traveled further afield as new gods and worshipped them, as Earth humans have done since time immemorial with human beings from Earth, who brought good teachings or evil heresies, turned them into faith circles and faith religions, etc., and found followers for them, some of whom were strictly fanatical and others even dangerous, even to the point of murder. This is because religions and their beliefs were all invented and spread from the ground up on false doctrines, Abalton, as well as on hatred, Alsotan, murder and manslaughter. Just as every worldly belief has brought nothing but death, strife, misery, revenge and misery since time immemorial, and continues to bring greed and wars, which will continue to be the case. The fact is also that the more human beings populate the world, the more rebellion, strife and war will prevail among the nations in the future. The human beings will become more and more violent. Domestic violence will become more and more widespread, murders of all kinds as well as criminality, and all crimes will increase in the nations, including organized crime. Religions and other religious groups have existed since time immemorial and will continue to exist for a very long time, providing the reason to mold and abuse politics in such a way as to cause wars and terror, as well as to boost the arms industry and engage in immense military armament, as it will be especially in the next 50 years of this millennium and coming in the 3rd millennium as a result of a war mania in a worldwide wise, whereby it will again be the case that the world domination addiction of the Far West is behind everything that Svath and I saw and realized. These world domination addicts in particular, but also the fear of all peoples of these, as well as the delusion of the incompetent leaders of many states, will be guilty of this, namely that the fearful hoarding of military materials on a large scale will be triggered and a horrendous military build-up will be caused in the third decade of the next millennium, especially in the states of Europe. This is because those in power at that time will be particularly incompetent in matters of governance, as they will have no sense of nature and its fauna and flora, and in this respect will have only fanatical, morbid and destructive illusions. In the Far West, it will unfortunately be the case that the murderous secret society Ku Klux Klan, which has existed for 103 years, can continue to murder people of different colors and beliefs and white-skinned human beings who help them with impunity. Over the course of time, the murderous secret society has split into various groups that act differently according to their fanaticism. Overall, however, they all consist of murderous Jew haters and race haters, because they all hate human beings who do not have the skin color white and whom they consider inferior and unworthy of life, regardless of which race they belong to. It is therefore irrelevant to the secret allies who mask themselves in their murderous cowardice what race the human beings they hang, shoot or otherwise murder belong to. Consequently, it is equally irrelevant to them whether the victims have a light or dark, brown, yellow or red skin color. So the victims do not just have to be distant descendants of the slaves who are mainly stolen in Africa. The people of other colors and other faiths are racially persecuted and murdered by the secret society members, as are the indigenous people, whereby all of the murderous secret society members call themselves Christian believers, but are generally fanatically hostile towards non-Christians, which is, however, kept secret from the public. This is why it has also not been made public that some of the fanatical secret society members have murdered white people out of hatred for people of other faiths. And this hatred is also particularly directed against people of color who publicly stand up against the racial hatred of the secret society, just as fanatical race haters who are not members of the secret society profess and murder in the same way, which will become apparent in about 20 years' time when a very well-known brown-skinned pastor is murdered by one of them. 36 years ago, fanatical members of the murderous Ku Klux Klan secret society were already endeavoring to spread their racial hatred and hatred of Jews in Europe, specifically in Germany, but this only became known about 5 years later. But their Jew-hating ideology mainly spread to an element that was blindly angry at Jews because they had been tormented in Vienna in their earlier years, and because later, according to lying propaganda, Jews were allegedly the ones to blame for Germany losing the World War. This element, which was also already characterized by the traditional hatred of Jews, doubled and tripled this hatred, leading to the World War of 1939 to 1945. This fact, however, was concealed by certain parties despite their precise knowledge of it, just as it is to be kept secret for all time. As well as the fact that from the very first efforts of the Ku Klux Klan in Germany, Hate elements and movements have since emerged that have been spreading throughout Europe ever since, displaying a Nazi-like political hatred that will also be carried over into the future of the third millennium. As a result, this hatred will remain for a very long time and will continue well into the next millennium. Many state leaders and parts of the population will also be affected by this, especially in Germany, whereby their Nazi attitude will also rub off on state leaders and parts of the population. And these state leaders, their vassals and sections of the population, will especially be those whose direct or indirect ancestors hated the Soviet Union because their war campaign against it failed and Germany lost. This blazing hatred will be transferred to many of the losers' descendants, and in turn to their descendants ideologically, who will also be greedy for power and almost like-minded as those who created a grouping from the Ku Klux Klan endeavors in Germany that acted similarly. In the future, however, this will mean that such groups will continue to emerge, and this murderous ideology will openly and also secretly gain a foothold in Germany, just as a group known as the Führerkreuzritter or similar has existed for decades. A so-called political authoritarianism or a fascist and anti-democratic attitude will emerge from new groups, as Sfaff explains. This will give rise to a wide variety of groups, some of which will be highly criminal and even criminal. On the one hand, this is because the Ku Klux Klan, which comes from the far west, will quickly spread and act in different ways in the future, and on the other hand, many human beings in Germany still harbor an unbridled hatred of the Soviet Union because, as I said, Germany lost the war of aggression against the Soviet Union in the last World War. This hatred is of a Nazi-like mentality, which will take on various forms and also spread to various groups, such as the security forces, that is to say the police and military, especially the occupying military in Germany, who will behave like Ku Klux Klan supporters in this way, which will supposedly be stopped after the whole thing is uncovered, but will continue secretly. This will also spread in a modified wise in the leaders of the state and in parts of their superiors, as well as in many of the vassals and in parts of the population, but as hatred that they are not able to bring under control because they cannot realize it within themselves. And this hatred is the whole of their Nazi mentality which, as I said, they are unable to perceive in and of themselves, which is falsely misunderstood and represented as a democratic attitude. However, because they are not aware of the truth as a result of their Nazi mindset, they will defame, persecute and prohibit all those groups in the German population and in the state leadership who strive for peace and freedom and want to do what is right. This, while they themselves, in their Nazi mindset, will do everything wrong, create enmity against the Soviet Union and other states, and the danger of a new terrible war. Consequently, in the future, in the third millennium, the hatred of the ancestors will be carried on by the leaders of Germany, as well as many leaders of other states who are of the same Nazi mindset and who falsely believe that their attitude is democratic against the Soviet Union in an erroneous imitation, taking revenge, which unfortunately will not have a good end. Just as the Ku Klux Klan will continue to exist in various groupings in the far west and will carry on far into the third millennium, bringing further mischief, as it will also do in Europe, especially in Germany, with very foul-smelling blossoms. And in the new era of the new millennium, as cannot be mentioned enough, the world domination addicts of the far west will then also very insidiously instigate a war lasting several years in the far east of Europe, and will particularly frighten European states and their leaders, who will still harbor the after effects of their ancestors. Consequently, they will refer in a Nazi-like manner to fears that are still based on the defeat that the Third Reich suffered in the campaign against the Soviet Union. It, however, will not be known, realized or understood by those descendants who will in future be in state leadership, particularly in Germany, France and other European states, and who will continue to harbor the hatred of their ancestors against the Soviet Union. In the future, however, the name of the state will be changed, but the evil hatred of the war losers created during the last World War, which will be passed on to their descendants, will inevitably and unjustly lead to dissidents who will not be willing to follow the hatred of the Nazi thinkers, because they will not be able to comprehend the hatred of the descendants of the Soviet Union. For this reason, especially in Germany, the Nazi-minded leaders of the state and their supporters among the people will accuse them of right-wing extremism, which will even lead to evil hatred, false accusations, and unconstitutional actions, and also to measures that will be unlawful. Unfortunately, this will be the case and nothing else, which in itself will cause a lot of controversy, as well as family feuds and broken friendships, which will also inevitably lead to murder and manslaughter. The same as for political reasons will also result from religious hatred and hatred of faith, as well as from worldly delusions of faith, which invariably only consist of views and opinions. Everything in this regard will be created anew, whereby Christians and Jews in particular will once again be full of hatred, because degenerate believers in Islam will start to stir up evil, causing thousands of people of other faiths to lose their precious lives and die as a result of religious murders or religious murders, because people of other faiths, especially Christians and Jews, will once again be hunted down in the future. And as it was in the Nazi war, so it will be again, only this time it will be that the distant descendants of those persecuted and murdered in the last war will wield the sword of death themselves, and equally against those of other faiths, especially against those who pay homage to Islam and Christianity. Ordering war murders by a Nazi corpse, who will be deadly and genocidal out of murderous greed and misery and hardship, will come to the land in the east of the Mediterranean. The murderousness that is already hidden in this wise today will certainly only be correct shortly after the second decade of the new millennium, and new hatred and murder will arise worldwide and be directed against the distant descendants of the Torah believers. Consequently, they will continue to fall prey to the vendetta just as their earlier ancestors have been hated, persecuted and murdered by the millions since time immemorial, as in the Nazi war, because it will be nothing else. And that will be the case, as will many other things, such as many other wars and political terror, namely religion-related, as well as greed for land, greed for wealth, obsession with power and evil reasons of state, and also all kinds of other state and civil crimes and much violence, strife, malice and other outsorting of all kinds, etc. Great exterminations will occur in nature as well as in its fauna and flora and in the whole of creation in general, because the growing earth humans will destroy everything. Everything visible and invisible in general is creation, and this has nothing whatsoever to do with an unreal, religious, imaginary, and therefore non-existent God and God-creator, who is to be idolized, worshipped, and prayed to by believers in religion or God. This is supposedly because he is supposed to protect and help through adoration, worship, and supplication. What is truly important, however, is that human beings are helpful to themselves when they themselves think clearly and correctly, switch, manage, act, and exercise righteous might over themselves, so that they are able to protect and help themselves at all times through their own energy, strength, logic, understanding, and reason. However, this requires that man himself consciously endeavors and cares for his entire progress by educating himself in all necessary ways and changing himself to the good and correct in such a way that he transforms himself into a true human being and humanity, and, in the awareness of truth, shows it the necessary honor, respect, and dignity. However, the fact that human beings urgently need to take this seriously and consciously tackle and implement this change in the foreseeable future in order to inevitably save what can still be saved has unfortunately been thrown to the wind for quite some time, and also now in 1949, as it will unfortunately also do in the future, as a result of which nothing will change for the better. This will prove to be particularly true after the change to the next millennium, when unfortunately, as usual, the necessary things will not be done to create peace and freedom, because on the contrary, the Far West will invade Iraq with war at the beginning of the 1st century or of the 3rd millennium through a web of black lies, and not only murder and destroy senselessly, but also create death, misery, hardship, and long-lasting chaos and disaster. So in the new millennium, too, Earth humans will unfortunately not do the correct thing, which would be absolutely necessary. Consequently, all their quarreling will lead more and more to very bad consequences in the long term, especially through a future involvement of emerging and malicious artificial intelligence programmed for war, as well as insidious warfare by remote-controlled armed flying objects of small and large size, as Svath and I have observed in the future and seen and experienced in action. A new war will soon begin in Korea in a few months' time, and in the following decades of this century various others will cause death and destruction, with the distant and world-dominating West bringing much disaster to various peoples and states on Earth. But it is not only wars that will continue to rage through the world. The coming period will also bring strife and strife, as well as much suffering, hardship, misery, and enmity, for which Al-Satan, robbery, hatred, greed, violence, greed for profit, murder and manslaughter, revenge and jealousy, etc., will often be the reasons. However, the real but secret and insidious author of the worst of all things, namely wars, will be the Far West, which has been acting for a long time in a world-dominating manner with its political and hypocritical intrigues, as well as its behavior full of lies and world police airs, and it will continue to act in this way far into the future. This will intensify in the coming decades, but will become particularly acute in the new millennium, when the distant Western leadership will continue all the wars that will be waged around the world in the coming decades. And in the future, in the third decade of the new millennium, a leader from the far West will fall prey to delusions of grandeur and a dictatorship to which all states on earth will submit, and which will be led by the West as a whole. The global economy and the behavior of the financial sector worldwide will then also be thrown into great turmoil, which will also cause a very nasty chaos that has never been seen before and could never happen. But furthermore, there will be multiple evils for the entire world, the planet and nature, including its fauna and flora, as already mentioned several times, because the climate will be overturned and bring many disasters, deaths, tremendous storms, destruction, and, in the north of the earth, great heat and many forest fires worldwide. This will particularly affect America, Europe, and, in many places, Asia, Australia, South America, and Africa, where major forest fires will bring much hardship and destruction. This will also particularly affect various countries in Europe and the Far East, causing much suffering and misery, but, as clearly stated, various other countries around the world where forests are an important form of land cover will also suffer great disaster. Elsewhere, however, various countries will be hit by severe droughts and heat, which will mean that the land will not recover for years and will also cause many deaths. Many things will wither and die out due to the heat. Just as many human beings will also die due to the great heat, and some areas will become devoid of human beings because they will move away in many places or die from the heat. And what can be said for the future, what Sfaf and I have seen and experienced, is that there will be evil and very bad things, with many evils, deaths and wars being created by an emerging artificial intelligence, resulting in great calamities in some places. And it will inevitably come about in such a way that wars will no longer be fought and killed man against man, but that bullets will be fired and missiles launched from secret hiding places in order to murder and destroy targets, while small flying war machines, bomb-carrying machines, shooting machines and aeroplanes, remote-controlled by handheld devices, will whiz through the air and spread death, destruction and devastation. That one-day war will be waged against Earth humans by artificial intelligence, and that great misery and fear will spread among human beings, as well as evil chaos, is as certain for the future as that every morning is followed by another evening. And as far as the exuberant growth of irresponsibly and senselessly breeding, and thus steadily increasing Earth humans is concerned, it will lead to the atmospheric conditions changing drastically for the worse, as all land, even deep into the soil kingdom, and the vital waters will be poisoned by humanity to such an extent that many diseases, torments, and deaths will spread. This is in addition to the fact that in many cases the natural water conditions, such as rainfall, change in their value, and even cause the land to dry out in many places because the rains fail to fall, as also happened on Rapa Nui, for example, and the human beings fled the island. The same thing also happened on Mars, but was forced by the early humanity that once lived there. which forced and provoked climate change as a result of its arrogance, unreasonableness, overconfidence and hubris, which is why the peoples there fled to earth or largely died. And truly, through earth humans' own fault, almost the same downfall threatens worldwide in the coming time. Just as something threatening is approaching from solar space, which will create fear and horror, death, destruction, as well as crime and other evil and disaster. And the coming new warlike disaster will soon be renewed, starting in just 10 months in Korea. First carried out by the North against the South, and interfering by China, then acting as it has done since time immemorial by the Western world domination addicts, the military power of the Far West. With the start of what is to come in Korea, the course of what will only mean doom will begin, namely the very long-lasting epoch of war mania that will reach far into the third millennium and spread to the leaders of many countries. The guilt of this madness will be triggered solely by the Western world domination addicts, and so the war mania will spread all over the earth through the war ambitions and the example of the West, which will promote war fanaticism and war partisanship and powerfully penetrate the brains of like-minded people. And it cannot be repeated enough that wars will also be provoked and triggered all over the world in the future, especially by the Far West. This will prove to be the case in practically all the coming decades of this century, when the malicious lies of the West in Eastern Arabia, but especially also in the new millennium, will once again result in wars in Eastern Arabia through the fault of the West. And in the east of Europe, there will also be a long-lasting war, for which the West will again be to blame, and will provoke this war against the East in a roundabout way. This war will be perfidiously and deceitfully fueled by the might of the Far West, which will also once again indoctrinated by the Far West, be promoted and supported in many cases by various hypocritical state powers, either biased or out of fear, by supplying weapons, money and other aid to the warring party that promises them future profit. State powers in various European countries, who are guided by lies from the distant West and out of old hatred against Russia, will incite other countries and will then endeavor in a criminal manner to do everything in their power to ensure that the hatred against Russia flares up again and bears evil fruit. Consequently, in the new millennium, weapons, ammunition, technology and other aid will be partisanly supplied to the opposing side of the belligerents attacked by Russia, because this will be very insidiously arranged by America in the blind hope of forcing down the ancient land of the bear and making it a vassal of America, which is addicted to world domination. And it will be the case that dozens of powerful states in various European countries will be of the same hateful disposition as the leaders of America, who, as only 4.5 years ago elsewhere, committed the most egregious crime of all time in known human history. This, when absolutely and completely irresponsibly atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, murdering hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings. Yet Earth humans remain silent about this boundless crime, just as America will also be helped if it provokes a war in Eastern Europe in the next millennium, into which the East will be forced, so to speak, and consequently weapons and ammunition etc. will then be supplied to the other warring party on a partisan basis. Many leaders of many states, and this should be said again, who will do this, will not be aware of their Nazi sentiments when they irresponsibly supply weapons and ammunition etc. to a warring party in Eastern Europe supported by the West, whereby the war will last for several years and become a strange world war. The effective truth, however, will not be realized by the leaders of many countries who are completely blinded by low intelligence and therefore hypocritical, some of whom fear the West, so they will dance to their tune, and the war will go on for a long time. And it all begins with the fact that war mania will emerge in the coming decades as a result of many wars, starting with the fact that a new war will be triggered in Korea in a short time. And indeed, the war in Korea, which is now just around the corner, will trigger the coming and unstoppable war mania, to which many leaders and other people in the military, politicians, and the general public who have fallen prey to the lust for power will succumb in the future. And from now on, this mania for war will be unstoppable for a very long time and well into the next millennium. The majority of the peoples of all states will be responsible for this because, in their simple-minded indifference and irresponsibility, they will appoint the power-hungry and those incapable of leadership as their national administrators, leaders and rulers. Something that was not so common in earlier times until the last World War, as it will inevitably come in the coming times, and as more and more incompetent leaders will come to the helm of state power worldwide. And this will happen without the voters, who believe themselves to be responsible, bothering to do anything about it, and consequently without anyone endeavoring to find out how, who and what the people to be elected will basically be. As a result, it will practically always be the case that only those who are greedy for power, weak in character, and absolutely incapable of leadership will be elected to state leadership positions worldwide. And in this way, more and more incompetents, even those clothed in gold, lies and deceit, will be able to sneak or hoist themselves into state leadership as rulers, both men and also more and more women, who will be equally incompetent and power-hungry. Since time immemorial, these have actually all been purely male domains, with a few exceptions. But this will change in the future, because in the times to come, women will increasingly rise higher and higher and come to power, which is nothing to object to and is correct, but it should be the right persons who would hold their office honorably, not unfairly, unjustly, and only personally for themselves, but for the people. Unfortunately, however, nothing will change with regard to the miserability and therefore the lack of leadership, so all the bad governance will not change, and everything will remain the same in the future. And this will continue to be the case, at least until the people finally wake up from their indifference, irresponsibility and lethargy, and endeavor to finally do the correct thing. Many of the lunatic leaders of European and global states will continue to be unjustifiably and stupidly exalted by the majority of peoples who have been struck by low intelligence, and thus by non-thinking, and many will also continue to turn to the world's domination addicts from the West, who have been indulging in their bloody and war-driven addiction mania since their early existence in 1776, and thus from time immemorial, and have been doing so for around 173 years now. In this sense, the Western power also razed Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the ground with atomic bombs 4 years ago, thereby murdering many hundreds of thousands of human beings, without any of the peoples of the earth having demanded even the slightest accountability from the West. As has been customary since time immemorial, the West has never been and will never be held accountable for its crimes, because cowardly fear and false friendship prevail among all peoples with regard to the West, just as the desire for profit means that relations with the West do not want to be spoiled. Because profit always takes precedence over everything, so America's war crimes and other crimes against humanity are also accepted indifferently and as irrelevant. But the question is certainly not whether those who do this and simply accept everything without question and do not have the courage to intervene against the criminal actions of the West, whether they do not have the same civil attitude, to which one can only say, "Ugh, devil." All this despite the fact that, like those in power in the West, the Western world domination addicts are strictly religious and have many religious sects, but nevertheless exhibit unparalleled criminality, and probably also criminality in some cases, even if it cannot be proven because everything that is really going on is concealed. Just as there is also an unspeakable and limitless amount of unscrupulous and irresponsible military activity all over the world through wars and interference in the politics of foreign countries, both intelligence and military, that goes unpunished on a massive scale. This is how many political murders take place, but the majority of Earth humans remain indifferent. And this will continue decade after decade for all the years to come and decades of the 20th century, which is still ongoing, and also in the third millennium. Consequently, it will be absolutely and completely certain that all those who have been characterized and obsessed by the mad mania for war and the extremely greedy and sick delusion of world domination since time immemorial, and many like-minded people, as well as descendants of the criminals of the World War that ended only 4 years ago, will bring forth new wars and plunge the world further into misery and hardship. This will happen especially when, in the new millennium of the third decade, the delusion of the leadership of the world's domination addicts from the West will nonsensically threaten the world and its economy because, crazily enough, the West is supposed to be great again. This is despite the fact that this multi-state is the most powerful in the world. As a result, however, the new and insane state leadership will bring its own country into a negative position, which will then come dangerously close to a dictatorship due to confused megalomania and lust for power, as well as a damaged, diseased mind and absolute irrationality. This will almost lead to a situation like the one that was created millions of years ago on 2 planets, resulting in the asteroid belt. This was the case when the first human-like life forms, foreign and distant travelers from the depths of the universe, lived on the worlds opposite each other in the solar system and orbiting in the same orbit between the giant planet Jupiter and the Earth-like planet Mars at various times, many millions of years ago, around 560,000 million kilometers from Earth. This was 5 billion years after the formation of the solar system, which first developed from 2 suns, but only became the actual solar system when the second sun moved away and was hurled off to disappear somewhere in space in the galaxy or Milky Way. The development of the solar system into what it is today took several billion years, because in prehistoric times it was still wild, with meteorites and other formations, and completely disorganized, so that it only developed into what it is today in the last 800 million years. However, it is still in a state of constant change, meaning that its system is constantly changing, and in the distant future it will have passed away and will no longer exist. The human beings or human-like life forms on both planets between Mars and Jupiter got behind each other and became hostile to each other, completely destroying their home planets as a result of their hostilities, the large fragments of which were hurled into the vast space of the honeycomb cosmos as huge asteroids. Exactly the same thing can also happen on Earth due to the unreasonableness and greed for power of human beings, which can occur as a result of the insane self-importance of state leaders, their vassals, and those insane and unreasonable human beings who are indifferent and irresponsible, especially those who enrich themselves through their greed for the peoples. In particular, it is the powerful state rulers and their vassals and lackeys, as well as the sections of the lowly intelligent population who cheer them on. And in the coming future, it will often only be human beings who mismanage the state and are greedy for money, who only want to hoard lots of mammon instead of fulfilling their duty of governance and avoiding any kind of war or other mass murder or murder at all. All this, as the ever-increasing indifference and complete irresponsibility of the endlessly increasing Earth humans, also threatens the Earth with a sad and very evil future. And what will come in particular and inevitably, and bring a great deal of disaster in the next millennium, is certainly the climate crush that has been developing for some time now, which will undoubtedly become more and more noticeable in the coming months, and then fully develop in the coming third millennium, against which Earth humans will be completely helpless. This will inevitably happen, and if logic, understanding, reason and responsibility do not yet prevail, and the humanly possible is not done to minimize the coming evil effects of the climate crash here and there, or even prevent it in part, then there will be much howling and cries of grief that will shake the world, because countless deaths, suffering, misery, hardship, and huge destruction will be rampant across the entire globe. And in addition, Earth humans, through their low intelligence and irrationality, sexual excess, and in ignorance of the fact that the Earth can only support and feed a limited number of just over 500 million human beings, will overflow and not only plunder the planet of its resources and rob it of its stability, but will largely destroy much of nature and exterminate much of its fauna and flora. The growth of Earth humans to many billions, in only about 80 years there will be 10 billion, that is to say 19 times more than the planet Earth is capable of supporting and feeding, will lead to large parts of wildlife being wiped out forever, and thus fauna and flora being decimated to such an extent that the whole thing can never be replaced again, not even almost. In order to preserve the planet, nature and its fauna and flora, and comprehensively for the existence of all life, it is already necessary that everything that is necessary and correct is recognized, undertaken, and done. This is particularly important in order to contain the worst form of the climate collapse that has already been brought about all over the world by the World War and the criminal dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But my word will be like a cry in the wilderness, because the world-dominating West will continue to vehemently cause and bring about wars, destruction, misery, hardship, and savage destruction all over the world well into the next millennium and far beyond. This will also be accompanied by the howling and participation of some other states, with the leaders and their vassals and the lowly intelligent sections of the European population in particular irresponsibly joining in instead of standing up to the evil, murderous and destructive. Furthermore, in 2 years a community of diverse states will be founded in Europe, which will soon expand throughout Europe and later become a secret dictatorship, whereby the freedom of citizens and human beings will be largely suppressed in a strictly dictatorial manner and then harassed in every wise by the artificial intelligence. This will happen absolutely unchecked because all the peoples of the earth will not finally unite and defend themselves against the West, which has been addicted to world domination since time immemorial, and the enslaving machinations of state leaders, their authorities and vassals, as well as all financial institutions, which are already emerging. This also applies to all the military fanatics who force innocent and free citizens into compulsory military service and senseless killing in wars. But also in the future, due to indifference and irresponsibility, nothing will be done by the populations to shield themselves against all these unjust machinations and to put everything in its place in order to be free from state coercion. But it is also really urgent that the world population, which has already increased drastically and criminally too much, is stopped in its actions in this regard, because the reckless increase in the human population has already caused a great deal of damage to the planet, nature and its fauna and flora, which must be urgently remedied and further damage avoided. But unfortunately, this will also not be heeded, because as Sfaf and I have seen by traveling into the distant future, the Earth's population will continue to be driven up irresponsibly into the billions. At the beginning of the next millennium, it will already be the case, and this cannot be emphasized enough, that the planet itself will already be dangerously damaged by the exploitation of its resources. However, this will not be recognized by geologists, so exploitation will continue, and the planet will change internally to such an extent that it will take revenge. But it will not only be the planet, for nature and all its fauna and flora will also suffer, and many things will be increasingly oppressed and others completely wiped out, while much will quickly and certainly be completely destroyed by the irresponsible and negative machinations of humanity directed against them. In other words, if Earth humans do not finally develop their common sense and do not depose and remove those power-hungry state leaders who are absolutely and completely incapable of leading states, but only enrich themselves and indulge their delusions according to their senses and desires, then things will really become immeasurably worse. Only through real elections and knowledge of the character and behavior of those to be elected can absolutely honest leaders be brought to power. Otherwise the world will be in a bad way in the future, which will also be helped by an artificial intelligence that will contribute to all future disasters. Unfortunately, however, it will come to pass that the majority of people's intellect and reason will not become active, because, as has been the case since time immemorial. They will still be trapped in various religious beliefs for a very long time, as a result of which they will not be able to think for themselves, but will only be able to circulate illusory thoughts. But this means that all the evils will become even greater, especially because, through the fault of the incompetent leaders of all the states on earth, who only indulge in their might and neither order nor allow any measures to be implemented, Earth humans will finally reflect on logic, understanding and reason, and keep themselves rationally low in all things, and not go overboard. This is so that the planet and all life in nature and its fauna and flora are not jeopardized, impaired in their species and nature, hunted, destroyed, annihilated, and even wiped out, which is already dangerously imminent. That my words will be completely useless, and will simply fade away in the desert of being unheard, as Sfaf and I have seen and experienced in the future. And I will also be cursed, hated, called a liar, and threatened with my life for my open and true words in the near and distant future in the next, the third millennium, just as I am now. This is because the truth does not want to be heard, and does not want to be seen, how slowly, but surely everything is decaying and going down the drain. Slowly and insidiously, human beings on earth will become more and more indifferent, dishonest, uneducated, addicted to alcohol and many poisons of all kinds. And they will become more and more addicted to religious and worldly delusions of faith, whereby they will increasingly conceal their confused illusory thinking with lies and deceit. The honor of human beings, which still exists to some extent, is disappearing faster and faster, and in future will give way to a frightening indifference, irresponsibility and depravity, which will lead to a rapid increase in crime and even more crime, with religions of this kind appearing, which are addicted to greed and might, and do not shy away from murder. The near future will also see an increase in the mania for great wealth and physical beauty, fornication, personal prestige, sports addiction, and other addictions of all kinds. Many human beings will become pathologically addicted to these things, amassing millions and billions in money, but none of the many addicts will realize the damage caused by their actions. Many will not become rich through work, but because they will shamelessly and work shyly present themselves to the public as objects for show, which will happen especially from the next millennium onwards through modern technology, namely through the advent of so-called picture tubes, through which human beings can present themselves moving on picture windows. In addition, countless Earth humans will develop a very pathological addiction to all kinds of natural intoxicants and artificially produced addictive substances, which will cause countless deaths and suffering in all countries on Earth. All the explanations and endeavors of many medical and educational forces, aid workers, and the emerging drug police, etc., dealing with this problem will be completely helpless against it. There will be no effective defense against this drug epidemic, which will come worldwide, as there will also be no defense against organized crime in the larger countries of the earth, whereby it will not only be the traditional mafia from Sicily that will spread murder and mischief on earth. Crime will also become increasingly prevalent in the Far West, Europe, and the Far East, and large criminal organizations, some of which have been up to their murderous mischief since time immemorial, will become so powerful that the state security forces will no longer be able to stand up to them, or that nothing equivalent or much more powerful will be able to counter them. Consequently, this will degenerate worldwide to such an extent that real criminal armies will reign, against which all state officials and security forces will be completely powerless. However, the addiction to faith, religious or secular, will also flare up again as a result of lying preachers, who will all use the new technology of the picture tube screen to spread their lies and their belief in lies, and thus become rich in their millions. Because all the believers in lies will make the female and male preachers of lies rich through horrendous donations. The believers of both sexes are permanently clouded in their minds and reason by the lies of faith, and these are thoroughly obstructed, as a result of which their very own real thinking is switched off. Consequently, the brain or its ability to think is completely atrophied to such an extent that it is only given a very sparse space for illusory thinking. This is no longer sufficient to recognize and understand the actual reality and its truth, so that the ability to perceive reality and its truth is undermined, and normal instincts and motivations are impaired to such an extent that only belief dominates everything. In this way, the ability to recognize reality and its truth, as well as learning and understanding, not only also decreases more and more, but consequently the stultification or non-thinking also becomes more and more widespread and increases, whereby only belief expresses itself in a superficially powerful way. As a result, the consciousness is overloaded with wild assumptions and very unreal fantasies, delusions, erroneous ideas, and thus with empty beliefs, so that ultimately no reality and truth can be perceived, realized, and understood. Therefore, only the delusion of faith powerfully retains the upper hand, as a result of which reality is impossible to perceive. The completely mistaken and confused religious believers and believers in the world do everything they can, with their faith-based lies and deceptions, to ensure that everything remains in a confused and believing framework, and that everything continues to exist in this respect. In this respect, everything continues to flourish, live and bloom in the damaged part of the earthly influenced consciousness, whose energy and power is drawn from the consciousness of the life energy of creation. Nothing, but also nothing at all, can be done about this unless the individual human being finally learns to think for himself in logic, understanding and reason, and becomes willing to find and recognize reality and its truth. However, this requires that they free themselves from all beliefs and orientate themselves according to reality and its effective truth, and also behave accordingly. Now, if the majority of Earth humans do not finally do this, but only an absolute minority, as has been the case up to now, this will sooner or later bring disaster. For then, contrary to reason, humanity will grow to many billions, which will jeopardize the existence of all life, and even wipe out and exterminate much of it, as I have already explained several times. This is something that needs to be repeated over and over again, because the growth of Earth humans will lead to the worst catastrophe that has ever taken place in this world. This is because the entire creation, that is to say the planet itself, along with nature and its flora and fauna, will be increasingly harassed, destroyed and largely annihilated. Consequently, in less than 80 years from now, that is to say just a few decades after the beginning of the third millennium, everything will be threatened with extinction. This is because the mass of Earth humans will have grown irresponsibly to around 10 billion by then, and will have largely damaged and destroyed creation on Earth. As a result, the planet will be largely deprived of what is vital for all life through the exploitation of resources, overbuilding, and the destruction of nature. This on the one hand, while on the other hand, it must be said that nature and its fauna and flora, of which more than 55% will already be extinct at the beginning of the new millennium, and nature and its fauna and flora will absolutely need special protection as never before since the existence of the Earth. As all global destruction of all kinds must cease, including the poisoning of all the waters of the land and the seas, the earth and the atmosphere, and everything is to be renewed and made viable again. But that which will be so destroyed that it cannot be saved will have a very detrimental effect on the future of all life. All regions of glaciers and ice sheets, also the poles, will not be able to be saved, because it will already be too late to do so in the coming new millennium. And furthermore, it can be said for the future of Earth humans that in the foreseeable future they will probably be so far advanced with their primitive technology that in about 2 decades they will be able to reach solar space and the moon with primitive rockets thanks to the technical endeavors already underway. However, they will not be able to reach real space, that is to say outer space. Thus, it will not be possible for large parts of humanity to flee Earth and colonize other planets, which they will then, if they do manage to reach space and planets in the still distant future, probably also destroy once they succeed in space travel as the humanoids did hundreds of millions of years ago, who colonized the 2 worlds between Mars and Jupiter as the distant descendants of those who had traveled far away, but then fled from their planets to Mars and then to Earth many millions of years ago, before their home planets were completely destroyed by hostility and became asteroids. For a very long time to come, Earth humans, who will be overflowing in numbers in the future, will not be able to flee Earth and settle on Mars, for example. Nevertheless, efforts to do so will begin in the 2nd millennium after the first decades. But it will take extremely primitive rocket technology to get to Mars. It will take rockets and then a very long free fall to get to Mars, and a Mars landing will take place, and a station will be built for a few human beings to operate. For the time being, however, the moon is to be reached and entered in about 20 years' time, so that in the next millennium, primitive rockets can again be used to reach the planet Mars from there. But this primitive hopping in solar space will never be enough to penetrate into the true space, into outer space, and it will not even be enough to reach the unexplored end of solar space in the distant future. On the other hand, Earth humans will multiply and become so numerous in the coming times and far into the next millennium. The planet itself will be very dangerously affected by the overexploitation of natural resources. This will increase the dangers of earthquakes and seaquakes because the Earth's interior will increasingly shift and its groundwater masses will also be affected, which geologists will continue to deny for a long time because they will truly not effectively understand what they should fundamentally understand and warn and educate all those who overexploit or otherwise damage the planet. In the future, South American countries in particular, such as Chile, then Alaska in the north, as well as China and Indonesia, Sumatra, Morocco, Southeast Asia, as well as Greece, Japan, Italy and Turkey, Persia, and also Europe and various other particularly vulnerable countries will be hit by man-made earthquakes. So Switzerland and Europe will also be increasingly exposed to tectonic activity in the coming period of the new millennium, especially, as I said, from the third millennium onwards. Just as earthquakes and also seaquakes will increase worldwide, and atmospheric earthquakes will then also become noticeable, which have not been mentioned so far, but will be in the future. Furthermore, I can only repeat what I have said and written before, that the Earth's polar ice masses will soon melt rapidly as a result of the climate collapse that has been going on for some time, and the rising heat, which will also affect all the glaciers around the world, which will cause large masses of water to rise in the seas, as well as increasing humidity and clouds, which will cause huge rainstorms and wild floods and destruction, which will also cause a great deal of suffering and other calamities. Nature and its entire fauna and flora will be impaired and often destroyed, and in some cases much of the fauna and flora will be completely wiped out. In the time to come, all of this will be the unstoppable fault of Earth humans, who will multiply en masse, making all that exists indifferent and irresponsible, stoic, and inevitably provoking humanity's downfall. Everything will be unstoppable unless logic, understanding and reason can prevail against all expectations and thus prevent the worst. But just as human beings in all countries will create mischief in the future, will wage wars for all kinds of primitive reasons, religious revenge, greed for power, greed for possessions, and other nonsense, and thus work towards the downfall of the earth and humanity, attracting and conjuring up everything that is evil and destructive. Everything can only get worse, worse and worse. And just as the majority of humanity, as of old in many countries, will shout pro and hurrah in favor of wars and applaud them, nothing will improve as a result of the warmongering world domination addicts out of fear or false friendship, but will only get worse and worse. Consequently, the disaster will overflow, and the discrepancy to real peace will become ever greater. In the time to come and well into the next millennium, it will be inevitable that after the following and coming decades until the new third millennium, there will be war after war all over the world, and again only sham peace or occupations of states, mainly led by those addicted to world domination, but also many thousands of refugees worldwide from poor countries to the rich industrialized countries in the north of the planet. And now it is time to repeat. Farther, shortly after the beginning of the new millennium, the addicted world rulers from the West will greedily overthrow yet another government in order to invade a state in the East by war as a result of lies and deceit with provoked forces of the East. But this will only be the beginning of what the world domination addicts will continue to afford in the future. Namely, that in the third millennium, they will afford to continue in the first 3 decades what they will still allow themselves in this millennium in various wars all over the world. and as a frequent consequence, the coming decades of this current century will be characterized by roaring and howling all over the world, as well as loud hurrahs for the Western world dominating nations, which will continue well into the third millennium. This is because the low intelligence of the peoples does not recognize that the Western addicts of world domination want to devour the whole world. This will be because of fear of the world domination addicts, or because of low intelligence, or because the rulers and peoples are falsely friendly to the West, which wants to seize and dominate all the states of the earth. This will all happen because the unjust will condone all criminality and criminal behavior and all wrongdoing by the world domination addicts, and will stand by them indifferently in the face of their crimes, as will also be the case when, in the third decade of the next millennium, they, as a Western might, have war waged in Eastern Europe by a proxy Hanswurst, with the help of a great many stupid and partisan foreign states and parts of their populations, who will provide the buffon hired by the world domination addicts with a great deal of material for the war caused by the addicts who lust for total world domination. In addition to the fact that those in power, the stupid and the partisan, will also provide immense financial capital, which this hypocritical harlequin will enjoy and enrich himself immensely. The war instigated by the world domination addicts will result in those who are addicted to war mania, and those who are hopelessly enslaved out of friendship or fear, as well as the warmongers of foreign states, surrendering like dogs to the delusional world domination addicts, and dancing to their tune, and doing everything they want at that future time according to their will, lies and deceit. This is how it will come and become, and it is already predetermined that it will continue for a very long time in the new third millennium. In the process, evil will spread more and more in the world, and the majority of Earth humans will indulge in religion misleading violence, crime, warfare, self-profiling, lying and cheating, dishonesty and the dishonest acquisition of wealth, so that violence and murder will become the order of the day. On the other hand, however, those in power are becoming increasingly helpless in their greed for power and simple-mindedness, as well as in their absolute inability to lead the people, while in their incompetence they will brag with big words, with all the lies and delusions they can think of in order to conceal or whitewash their failures and lull the people into complacency and try to make them compliant. Through the guilt of religious and worldly faith and the impoverishment of effective education in terms of general knowledge, etc., Earth humans will become ever more irresponsible, indifferent, unscrupulous, and increasingly foreign to themselves. In the future, this will lead to the fact that the self-discovery of human beings towards true humanity will be completely prevented, because what is important for self-discovery and true human being, and thus also for the correct way of life, will be missing, namely one's own endeavors and the acquisition of the necessary knowledge and understanding, as well as the necessary cognition for this. From above, the government will secretly and underground prevent the education of the majority of Earth humans from becoming ever weaker and more insignificant in terms of their education, so that they can be forced more and more under the thumb of the greed for power of those incompetent rulers who, in this later century, will utilize an artificial intelligence that will already be active in the mid-1980s, but will be concealed from the public. With regard to the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora, it is necessary to understand and accept that nature as a whole is the basis of all life, because it is through it that the vital existence of all material life forms is possible in the first place, just as it is only through its biodiversity as a fundamental part of creation that all life is permanent. And to know and understand all this is of great importance for human beings, for in all this lies the creational energy and might, which is given as creation energy, and it is this which human beings can always utilize through logic, understanding and reason, and which enables them to form their own truthful thoughts realistically and also in accordance with reality and far removed from any religious or worldly belief. Creation energy is not only the existence of all energy and power that guarantees the life of every human being, as well as any other life form, but also the factor of creation energy itself, which evolves inexorably through ever-new revitalizations of human beings and of fauna and flora. This evolution takes place continuously as a result of the constant learning of the human being, accomplished by the consciousness of the respective animated person formed by the creation life energy, which continuously learns in life and acquires knowledge. This knowledge is accumulated in the material memory of the brain and transferred directly into the creation life energy by the consciousness formed by the creation life energy and stored there, because this life energy giver is also the knowledge energy store. This store stores all knowledge for all endless duration, which is created and thus stored by each constantly new personality, just as this knowledge, as well as the very diverse knowledge of all past personalities, is used again by the next completely new personality in a useful evolutive way, but always only unconsciously. However, how this useful application and utilization is used, formed, shaped and applied in a positive or negative way is determined by the new personality itself and alone, namely by how everything is absorbed, applied and shaped that daily life offers and produces, and what is made valuable or worthless in terms of character. This is especially true with regard to real and true humanity, or the false shaping and molding of the behavior of untrue humanity, which also results in abnormality and even Ausartung. With regard to upbringing, it must be absolutely clear that neither upbringing by parents etc. can ever take place, nor can the character and behavior of human beings be shaped by the upbringing of educators etc. Education is also not somehow related to the previous lived personality, because the false doctrine of reincarnation can and should never be taken into account in order to understand anything. It must therefore be absolutely clear that every thought, every form of character, behavior, attitude and action etc. is neither inherited nor somehow predetermined etc. Because every newborn personality starting according to its own thoughts, behavior and actions, and according to its own character to be formed. Every new personality, that is to say every human being, forms itself accordingly, through its self-education, according to how and what it absorbs from its direct and indirect environment, and thus shapes and forms its thinking, decisions, actions and behavior. This makes it clear that it is always, and in every case, the absolutely personal self-education that determines everything and every thought, decision, action and behavior as well as the attitude, and if no illness prevents it, the reason and intellect of the human being, and what becomes character and behavior. Consequently, any education by parents or other guardians is pure fantasy, because it is absolutely impossible to educate a human being as they educate themselves in every case, and therefore shape their own character and behavior. This happens in every single case and therefore with every human being equally. And it happens absolutely surely and inevitably in such a way that he adopts, at his own discretion and will, the character and behavior of what he hears, sees, or experiences. In this way, he shapes himself through his thoughts, attitudes, actions, and behavior, etc., according to the various influences that affect him. These influences, which come from other people, etc., and have and should have an educational effect, are normal, coercive, frightening, or even violent, threatening or loving, etc., from parents or grandparents as well as from other so-called guardians. From acquaintances, friends or foreigners, have the same effect on every human being in each individual case. They do so in such a way that they accept or reject them based on their own judgment, that is to say, they fit into something that is ordered, simply presented or taught to them. Ultimately, however, it is the case that, through his own decision, he consolidates or rejects in himself, in terms of character and behavior, what is brought to him educationally in an indoctrinating, hearsay, fear-inspiring, neutral, normal, loving, threatening, or violent way. Depending on whether or not he accepts what he is taught or whether he aligns his character and behavior accordingly or rejects it, he shapes his self-education at his own discretion, over which an educator never has any influence whatsoever. This therefore means that every human being carries out self-education in his life, according to what he perceives from the outside through his hearing and all his senses of perception, whereby everything outside serves as a model for him if he aligns his senses accordingly, whereby one forms his character and behavior in a self-educational way. This is precisely the case when self-education is indoctrinated and sustainably shaped in terms of character and also behavior according to a role model. However, if this role model self-education does not materialize, but is effectively rejected, then human beings carry out a form and wise form of self-education that is chosen either positively or negatively, depending on how the human being consciously builds up his or her attitude and behavior. All self-education by example, whatever its nature, as well as self-education in the positive or negative sense, entails that the human being has a certain character and develops a format that determines his mind and disposition. His entire character, his nature or disposition, and the nature of his personality, as it also determines his temperament and disposition, his nature or essence and nature, or his overall profile. The influences of other people, their ways of thinking, actions and behavior, etc., are factors that absolutely influence and shape the thinking, dispositions and forms of decision-making, actions, character formation, desires and behavior of the developing human being or not. And this happens according to what he accepts or rejects for himself. In other words, it is determined by whether he evaluates what is brought to him from the outside in a self-educationally positive or negative way, and from this determines and shapes his character, his behavior and his attitude, etc., in a negative or positive way towards the just or the unjust, towards the normal or the degenerate, or towards the positive or the negative. So it is never the upbringing of parents, grandparents, or other guardians, etc., but always and in every case, if it is not a disease or pathological Ausartung, always the self-education of the human being himself, however he also degenerates or degenerates. All other scientific and psychological explanations are and remain only nonsensical assertions, as they could not be more ignorant and lowly intelligent, as Sfaff explains. The human being as such should form himself into a true human being in every form and wise, and develop effective integrity in his consciousness in order to be able to live and act in such a way that he can express himself personally with all the standards of his values through his behavior. Developing personal integrity against everything negative is to be understood as loyalty to oneself and to one's own righteousness, whereby the human being with integrity lives honestly in his consciousness and acts in such a way that he is always able to express his standards and values honestly in all his personal correct thoughts in all his life, behavior, conduct, and actions. This characterizes absolute personal integrity, which, as loyalty to oneself, proves that absolute integrity and incorruptibility apply to him. Furthermore, integrity also stands for the decency and honesty of human beings, as well as for their righteousness, trustworthiness, absolute reliability, and profound trust. And these are values of true and effective humanity, whose high values also mean true love, peace, and freedom, which must be cherished and nurtured. The effective and true human being should be learned from the ground up from early childhood onwards. But it is often only learned by human beings with great effort and necessity during their lives, if it is learnt at all, because it demands the hard existence of reality. Namely, that a change of mind must take place with regard to everything negative, and a change towards the positive, in particular towards honest and true humanity. This is because true humanity harbors extremely valuable qualities that are expressed when a person understands another person and empathizes with what is going on inside them and what moves them. In particular, these values are firstly mindfulness and empathy, which must always be characterized by respect and tolerance. Furthermore, honest respect, consideration, and care must also be shown towards other human beings, because these are the absolute core values of what constitutes true human being, which, like true and profound love, true peace, and effective freedom, must be cherished and nurtured in all honesty and firmness of character. When the term true and genuine humanity is used, it is of course also associated with humanity, as it also has a broader and narrower meaning, namely that in the whole of true humanity, and the humanity shown to fellow human beings, everything that belongs to or is proper to the human being and relates to them is recognized. In this respect, these are all high values that distinguish human beings from animals, creatures, and all other life forms, which also defines the true human being's attitude and disposition, as well as human faults and weaknesses. Unfortunately, This is also linked to the fact that human beings as such make mistakes, because it is said that to err is human, but this does not and must never mean that they behave and think inhumanly and also act wrongly in this way. All these values mentioned, as well as many other behavioral values, are the practical themes of the Nocedemion teaching, which is the teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of the life, which should be learned by human beings on earth, and they should concern themselves with it, and thereby allow it to grow within them in order to become true human beings. In this respect, human beings are to become true human beings and also cultivate their true humanity, just as in this way they are also to appreciate and honor creation in the existence of all its energy and power of nature and its fauna and flora. All that exists of creation, as well as its endlessly lasting existence.
But this is one of the long and extensive articles that I also wrote during the breaks at school, and which Esther W. stole from under my desk at school, as did others, and then gave to the teacher, who of course kept it. He beat me up miserably for it, together with the Horiton. Your grandfather Svath then brought the article back to me after he found it in the teacher's desk, where he had locked it.
That is familiar to me because grandfather listed it in his annals.
Then there is nothing more to be said about it.
No, not really, except that I noticed that you made the same remarks word for word several times in various of your early articles.
I actually did, because I sometimes copied some things verbatim from other articles, because it saved me a lot of time. I learned that from Svath.
I also know that because he did it equally in his annals. But now, Edward, I have to do my duty and go. But I will often have to come here to correct it, because your article alone will take a long time to dictate to you.
That will be the case, but we will manage.
That will be the case. But now goodbye, my friend.
Then also goodbye and take care.
3rd May, 1320 hours.
Hello, there you are, Quetzal, my friend. I was actually expecting you earlier, as I was recently. This time, however, after Injana was here 2 days ago, and she told me that she would inform you that I wanted to see you urgently.
First of all, greetings, Edward. You know, my friend, that I...
Yes, I know that, and that you are on the 30th of April at 14:35 hours. That is now clear. But what?
I can only answer that...
That is interesting, and so I was not dreaming. Besides, last week on Sunday, Daniela and I were in the car park outside the garden seating area, when I went into the house and then out again after about 5 minutes. Daniela told me that then after about 3 days, it turned out that behind the house. And then, when I was in the kitchen talking to Jacobus and others, behind the house, at about the level of the end of the eaves of the cheese house.
That is seen to me.
I think so also.
That is reason enough for us now that is also the decision of the committee. I also have to inform you that we...
Thank you very much. You can also pass that on. Of course, also for you, by which I mean you, Bermunda and Florina and Injana, because you are all involved, and the fact that the committee obtained the necessary information through you four, which led to the measures. I would like to thank you four in particular because I did not know that. I really did not. And I would like to thank you especially for being concerned about that. I want to say that to the 3 girls in person when they come back. Without your maybe.
Besides, you know...
Yes, I know that, and I will also pay attention to that. Because it is necessary, otherwise it would already be. But to talk about it openly now, I think that would be out of place, which is why I will then replace everything with dots. Later, perhaps we can talk about it openly, but until then it is probably better to keep quiet.
That is your business. Consequently, you have to make up your own mind and know what will be correct and good. But now, Edward, I have to go because, as you can see here, I am being called. Goodbye, my friend.
Well then, goodbye also, and see you again. 8 May 2025, 00.14 hours.
Here I am again, Edward. Greetings.
You surprise me. You are very early, but hello also.
It is necessary that I come now, because in the meantime it has come to pass that, but the whole thing nevertheless requires that.
Of course, but I think we have talked about it enough and we would better move on to other things. In Germany, for example, there is the AfD party, which is being labeled and judged as right-wing extremists by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. This is despite the fact that this party, and also the other party, the BSW, is the only one, apart from the BSW, that wants to keep Germany neutral and not supply weapons to Ukraine or to the warmongering and America-dependent Zelensky. Of course, this does not suit all those who, without their own knowledge, have and advocate a neo-Nazi mindset because they are lowly intelligent and simple-minded and lack understanding and reason. That is why their thoughts and endeavors are biased towards supplying weapons and ammunition to Zelensky. That is to say, in line with Nazi thinking, without the ability to think that they are causing mischief instead of creating peace. In these neo-Nazi elements, hatred against Russia is still subliminally rampant because Hitler's army failed against the Soviet army in the last World War. This is what we have already explored, your grandfather Svath and I, and he said that this would continue to have a subterranean effect on Nazi descendants for well over 300 years, and that they would champion it if they came to power. And that has become a reality, and these descendants are proving it by being on fire to supply arms and ammunition to Zelensky so that he can continue the war, to which America is casually laughing in the background, whose fault the war really is.
What you say is dangerous, but it is the truth, and you should only make your dots on this when I dictate it all to you and you write it down. It is enough. It should also be mentioned that neo-Nazi elements have calculated what was decided against the AfD. The real secret and effective reason being that the people of Germany will once again be subjugated and will no longer have any rights, but will only be controlled and robbed by the neo-Nazis. And it will come to pass, as you already wrote in 1949, as I know from your article, that in Germany, a breach of the Constitution will unjustly take place because of this, and extremely unpopular parties that do not want hostility and do not want to participate in the actions of the neo-Nazis, but want to be peaceful will be accused of right-wing extremism. So it is actually true now and confirms what my grandfather and you have established.
It cannot be any other way, because we have been able to fathom it ourselves. In truth, the aim now is to make the people unfree, and to force them into a compulsory bailiff state order in which the population has nothing more to say, but only to track. In addition, the aim is to idiotically turn the people and the world back into a strict theocracy. America's bean-stupid presidential moron Trump is already serving as a role model, waving the lying Bible around in his hand.
I suppose I can think my piece on that and have no response to make. But as you say, you hit the nail on the head. That, Edward, shall be the end of our work and conversation today, for I have to return to my duty. For the next few days, I will have to attend to this, and so I wish you all the best until next time. Farewell, my friend, and goodbye.
Take care and goodbye, Quetzal, my friend.
Yes, goodbye again, Edward, good friend.